Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, just like always, I've got some longer stories lined up for you. Something you can just let play in the background while you relax, maybe do something else, or just slowly drift off. Before we get into it, I just want to say, however you're listening right now, whether you're gaming, scrolling, or trying to fall asleep, I appreciate you being here. And yeah, these ones are a bit heavier. Not loud, not dramatic. Just that slow, uncomfortable kind of story that sits with you. So settle in, let's start with the first one. So this happened about 8 months ago, and I still catch myself thinking about it at random times. Not because something huge happened all at once, but because of how gradual everything was. At first, nothing felt wrong. That's kind of what makes it stick. It didn't start with a problem. It started with something small enough to ignore. I work from home, have been for a few years now. Same routine every day: wake up, coffee, sit at my desk, log in, go through emails, meetings, the usual. It's predictable. Quiet, and honestly, I prefer it that way. Around that time, I moved into a new apartment. Nothing special, just a decent place in a quieter part of the city. One bedroom, third floor, small balcony. The kind of place where not much happens, which is exactly why I picked it. The building itself was pretty normal, mostly long-term tenants. People who kept to themselves. Occasionally you'd hear someone in the hallway, maybe a door closing, but that was it. No noise issues, no weird neighbors, at least not at first. About 2 weeks after I moved in, I started noticing something. And again, it wasn't anything major, just timing. Every morning around the same time I'd make coffee, like 8:15, 8:20, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway. Not unusual. People leave for work. That's normal. But it was always the same pace. Same rhythm, not rushed, not slow, just consistent. And at first I didn't think about it at all. It only stood out because I started recognizing it, like how you recognize a familiar sound without really trying. Then one morning I opened my door right as the footsteps passed, just coincidence, and I saw him. Guy in his early 30s maybe, neutral expression, holding a small backpack. He didn't look at me directly. Just kept walking toward the stairs. Completely normal interaction, or lack of interaction. I didn't think about it again. Until the next day, same time, same footsteps, same pace, and this time I didn't open the door, I just stood there listening, not in a paranoid way, just noticing. Then it happened again the day after that, and the day after that, every morning. Same time, same pattern, and yeah, I know what that sounds like. It's just someone leaving for work. That's it. That's the logical explanation. But here, where it got slightly off. One Saturday morning, I heard the footsteps again. Same time, same pace, and that didn't line up, because Saturday was the one day I slept in, or at least I tried to. But that morning I woke up early for no reason, and there it was, 8:20, footsteps, exactly the same as every weekday, which okay, maybe he works weekends, not that weird, except the next day was Sunday, and it happened again, same time. Same rhythm. At that point I started paying attention more deliberately, not obsessively, just aware, and once I did, I noticed something else. I never heard him come back, not once. Not in the afternoon, not in the evening, not late at night, just one direction every single day. And yeah, I tried to explain that too. Maybe I just didn't notice. Maybe my headphones were on, maybe I was out, all valid explanations, so I left it alone, for a while. Then one morning I decided to test something. Nothing big, just a small adjustment. Instead of making coffee at 8:15, I waited, sat in silence. Watched the time, 8:18, nothing, 8:19, nothing, 8:20, footsteps, right on time, and that's when it stopped feeling like coincidence. Not creepy, not yet, just precise, a little too precise. So the next day I changed something again. I opened the door before the footsteps, like 8:19, and stood there, waiting. At 8:20 he walked past. Same guy, same pace, same expression. And this time he looked at me, just for a second, no smile, no nod, nothing aggressive either, just acknowledgement. Then he kept walking. That moment should have settled it. Normal person, normal routine, end of story. But for some reason it didn't, because now I had confirmation of something very specific. He was moving on a schedule that didn't change. At all, weekdays, weekends, every day, same minute. Same pace, and for some reason that stuck with me more than it should have. At that point I still wasn't worried, just curious, because routines exist. People live structured lives. Wake up, leave, come back, repeat. There's nothing inherently strange about that. What made it stick wasn't the routine itself, it was how perfectly it held. So I started noticing other things. Small things, always small, like how I never heard his door open. That was the first one. You'd think that if someone is leaving their apartment every morning, you'd hear the door at least occasionally. A click, a handle turning, something, but I never did, just footsteps, already in motion, which didn't make sense but also wasn't impossible. Maybe his door was right next to the stairs. Maybe it didn't carry sound. Maybe I just missed it. Again, all reasonable. Then another detail. The backpack, same one every day, dark grey, slightly worn on one side, not unusual. Except it never looked any different. No shift in how it hung. No visible weight change, no small signs of use. Just the same, every single time. That started to get my attention more than anything else, because even with routines there's variation, tiny inconsistencies. People carry things differently depending on the day, but with him there was none. And the more I noticed that, the more everything else started to feel just slightly off. A few days later, I changed my routine again. Instead of waiting inside, I stepped into the hallway before 8:20, just stood there, leaning against the wall, phone in hand, trying to look normal. And when he came out this time, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. He didn't come out of an apartment door. He came from the far end of the hallway, near the stairwell, like he had already been there, walking, before I could have possibly heard anything. That didn't sit right, because the hallway isn't that long. If he started from his apartment, I should have seen or heard something before that point. But I didn't. He just appeared in motion. Again, not dramatic, but enough to register. He walked past me like before, same pace, same neutral expression, and again a brief glance, nothing more, then down the stairs. Gone. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, just thinking, because now the question had shifted slightly. It wasn't just, this is a consistent routine. It was, where is he coming from? And more importantly, why can't I ever track the beginning of it? That's when I started paying attention to evenings, because if mornings were consistent, maybe evenings would give me something. So that day I stayed home. No headphones, no distractions, just working, occasionally listening for movement in the hallway. Nothing. Hours passed. Afternoon turned into evening. Still nothing. Then around 7:40 p.m. I heard footsteps again. Different from the morning ones. Same person, but slower, less structured. And this time I heard a door, a soft click from somewhere down the hall. I stepped out almost immediately, not trying to be obvious, just curious, and I saw him walking toward his apartment. Same guy, same backpack, still on his shoulder. That's what caught me, because if he had left at 8:20 in the morning and just came back at 7:40, why was the backpack exactly the same? No shift. No change. Like it had never been used. Again, small detail, but it stayed with me. He unlocked his door, went inside, and that was it. Normal, completely normal. Except now I had both ends of the pattern. Morning, exact timing. Evening, vague return. And something about that imbalance didn't feel right. One was precise, the other was, and usually routines don't work like that. If someone is that structured in the morning, they tend to be structured in general. But this felt split. That night I tried to ignore it, told myself I was overthinking, which to be fair I probably was, at least at that stage. But the next morning I noticed something that made it harder to dismiss. I was already in the hallway again. 8:19, waiting, and this time instead of looking down at my phone, I looked directly toward the stairwell. At 8:20 he stepped into view, not from a door, not from an apartment, from the stairwell itself, already walking, already in motion. And that's when the question changed again, because now it was, where is he coming from? It was, why is he already there before he leaves? And that's a very different question. At that point I knew two things for sure. First, he wasn't leaving his apartment in the normal way I expected. Second, whatever his routine was, it began in the stairwell before 8:20. And that bothered me more than it probably should have. Not because there was anything obviously wrong with using the stairs. Of course there was, but because it made the whole thing feel slightly detached from normal apartment life. Like instead of guy leaves apartment at the same time every day, it had become, guy is already positioned in the stairwell at the same time every day. That's different, subtly but definitely. So I decided to test one simple thing. The next morning, instead of waiting on my floor, I went down one level and stood by the landing between the second and third floors at 8:18. Just to see if he was coming from upstairs, I'd hear him. If he was coming from his own floor, I'd see that too. I remember feeling a little ridiculous doing it, like I was turning some random neighbor into a private mystery project, but I was curious enough that I didn't care. 8:19, nothing, no door sounds, no footsteps above me, no movement below. Then at 8:20 I heard steps, but not from upstairs, not from the third floor, from below. From the first floor direction. He came up the stairs two at a time, but not in a rushed way, just efficiently. Then when he reached the landing, he slowed slightly, saw me standing there and gave me the briefest look. Not annoyed, not surprised exactly, just acknowledging that I was there. Then he kept walking up, past my floor, and went toward the stairwell exit on the fourth floor landing that led to the roof access corridor. That made no sense, not creepy. Just structurally confusing, because as far as I knew, the fourth floor roof access wasn't for residents. It stayed locked. There wasn't anything up there except maintenance space and a door to the building roof. So I stood there for a second after he passed, genuinely unsure what to do next. Then I followed, not closely, just enough to reach the landing maybe 10 seconds later. And when I got there, nobody was there, no footsteps, no door sound, nothing, just the locked roof access door. I checked it, still locked, didn't budge, and there was nowhere else to go. No apartment doors, no alternate hall, nothing, just the landing and the locked door. I actually stood there for maybe 20 full seconds just staring at it, because the only explanation was that he had already gone back down the stairs quietly enough that I somehow missed it, which was possible, but it didn't feel possible. Not in that tight, enclosed stairwell where every sound echoed. I went back to my apartment feeling more unsettled than I wanted to admit. Again, not afraid, just caught in that specific kind of confusion where your brain keeps trying to force things back into a shape that makes sense. Maybe he heard you and doubled back. Maybe he lives on another floor and you've misunderstood everything. Maybe there's another exit you didn't notice. So that evening I checked. I walked the whole stairwell, every floor, every landing, no hidden exit, no side corridor. No unlocked door to the roof, Nothing, just stairs. That should have made me feel better somehow, like at least now I knew the layout. Instead, it made the morning feel worse, because now there was less room for a normal explanation. The next day I told myself I was done. Seriously, no more checking stairwells, no more timing footsteps, no more building weird little theories around some quiet stranger in my building. And honestly, I meant it for most of the day. Then around 7:30 that evening, I heard movement in the hallway and looked through the peephole without really thinking. It was him, walking toward his apartment again. Same backpack, same neutral face, same quiet, measured pace. But this time, just before he reached his door, he stopped. Not for long, just stopped, turned his head slightly, and looked directly at my door, not at the hallway, not vaguely in my direction, at my door. Then he kept walking, unlocked his apartment, and went inside. That was the first moment it stopped feeling purely abstract, because up until then, all of this had lived in the space of pattern. Timing, movement, confusing routes, but that look, that made it personal, not threatening, not aggressive, but personal. And once that happened, I couldn't pretend I was just noticing a random routine anymore. Now it felt more like he knew I was noticing. After that, the whole thing changed shape. Not outwardly, nothing dramatic happened. No notes on my door, no weird messages, no confrontation in the hallway, but internally it changed. Because once you get the feeling that someone knows you're paying attention to them, every small interaction starts carrying more weight than it should. The next morning, I didn't go into the hallway, didn't wait by the stairs, didn't do anything weird. I stayed inside my apartment and just listened. 8:20, footsteps, same as always. That should have reassured me. If he was just doing his normal thing, then maybe the look at my door the night before meant nothing. Maybe he just heard movement inside. Maybe he glanced over by chance. That's what I told myself. And honestly, part of me believed it. But later that evening, when I came home from grabbing groceries, I found something small that made it harder to settle down again. It was nothing important. Just the little doormat outside my door. When I left that morning, it had been slightly crooked, not because I pay special attention to doormats, but because I had nudged it with my shoe while locking up and remembered seeing it off-center. When I got back, it was straight, perfectly aligned with the frame of the door. Now, yes, obviously, that could mean absolutely nothing. The cleaning staff could have adjusted it. Another neighbor could have bumped it differently. I could have remembered it wrong, all perfectly normal. But in the context of everything else, it felt placed. And the thing about these stories, the reason they're so exhausting when you're living them, is that almost every individual detail has a normal explanation. It's only when they pile up that they start feeling wrong. That night, I texted a friend about it. Not the whole thing, just a rough version. Something like, there's a guy in my building with a weirdly exact routine, and I think I've accidentally turned into a detective about it. My friend, being a normal person, told me I was probably bored and overthinking, which honestly was fair. If someone had told me the story at that point, I probably would have said the same thing. So the next day I made an effort to act normal, went to work from a cafe instead of home for a few hours, came back late afternoon, didn't look into the hallway more than usual, didn't listen for footsteps, just tried to reset. Then around 7:40 p.m. I heard movement outside again and checked the peephole. Him, same return time range as before, walking toward his apartment, but this time as he passed my door he slowed, not stopped, just slowed enough that it was noticeable, then kept going, and that's when I started getting annoyed, not scared, annoyed. Because confusion is one thing, but once you feel like the other person is somehow participating in the confusion, even subtly, it becomes harder to be generous about it. So the next morning I did something I hadn't done yet. I opened my door right as the footsteps reached it. Not before, not after, right at the moment they passed, and there he was, close enough this time that I could actually see details I hadn't noticed before. Slight stubble, dark circles under his eyes. Same backpack strap worn on one edge. He looked at me immediately, no surprise at all. And before I could even decide whether I was really going to say anything, he nodded once and said, "Morning." That completely threw me off, because until that point we had never spoken. Not once. And hearing him talk, hearing him sound totally normal, totally calm, made the whole thing feel briefly ridiculous again. So I said, "Morning," and he kept walking. Down the stairs this time. Not up, which was new. I stood there for a second after he disappeared, just processing that, because now the route had changed. Or maybe I had changed the part of the pattern I could see. Either way, it was different. And worse in a way, because speaking to me made him feel normal for about 3 seconds, and then the inconsistency snapped right back into focus. That afternoon, I asked the building manager a casual question, not about him specifically. Just something like, "Hey, do people have roof access in this building?" The manager looked up from his desk and said, "No." "Not unless they're maintenance." I asked, "Ever?" He said, "No, residents aren't supposed to be up there." That should have been a tiny piece of information, almost meaningless, but it landed harder than I expected, because now I knew officially that the route I'd seen him take toward the roof access landing was not part of normal building use. Again, maybe I had misread it. Maybe I lost track of him in the stairwell. Maybe he doubled back, but now the maybe had a little less room. That evening, I found myself listening for his return again, which I hated, because I didn't want this to become my routine too. I didn't want to become one of those people who quietly shapes their evening around a neighbor's footsteps, and yet there I was, waiting. At 7:43 I heard him. I checked the peephole. He passed my door, then halfway to his apartment he turned around, not fully, just enough to look back down the hall toward my door, again, then he went inside. That was the first moment where I stopped trying to convince myself that I was the only one generating the weirdness, because maybe I had started the noticing. Maybe I was the one building patterns out of details, but now, he was in it too. In some way he was aware of the same tension I was, and instead of collapsing it into something normal, he seemed content to let it stay strange. The thing that finally pushed it from weird neighbor pattern into something that genuinely got under my skin happened 3 nights later. And again, it wasn't dramatic. No break-in, no note, no obvious proof of anything, just one tiny detail. I got home a little later than usual, around 9 p.m. Long day, stopped for food, came back tired enough that I wasn't really paying attention to anything except getting inside and sitting down. I unlocked the door, stepped in, set my keys on the little table by the entrance and immediately stopped, because the chain lock was hanging differently. Now, before this sounds ridiculous, I know how small that is, but I use that chain every night when I'm home, and the way it hangs when it's untouched is very specific, slightly angled inward, because one of the screws is a little loose and the plate isn't perfectly level. That night it was hanging straight, perfectly straight. I just stood there for a second, staring at it. Then I told myself the obvious thing, you bumped it, that's all. So I closed the door, set the chain, and went about my night. But once I noticed that, I started noticing other little things too. The kitchen chair nearest the counter was tucked in slightly more than I usually leave it. The bathroom light switch was on the opposite side from where I instinctively flip it. Even the blanket on the couch seemed folded just a little tighter than I remembered. Again, every single one of those things had a normal explanation. Maybe I was tired, maybe I'd done them myself without thinking. Maybe I was primed to notice changes and therefore seeing them everywhere. That was still possible, but the feeling in the apartment was wrong. Not wrong in a horror movie way, just subtly handled, that's the best word for it. Like someone had passed through the space lightly enough not to leave damage, but firmly enough to leave order. I checked the door. No sign of forced entry. Windows locked, balcony door locked, nothing obvious. And honestly, part of me hated myself for even looking, because it made me feel like I had crossed into irrational territory. But another part of me, the much more tired part, was just deeply uncomfortable. So that night before bed I did something small. I left a mug on the kitchen counter instead of putting it in the sink. Not in the middle of the counter, just off to one side near the edge. Kind of thing that would stand out if moved, but not dramatic enough to feel staged. Then I went to sleep. The next morning it was still there, same spot, and that should have made me feel better. Really, it should have. Instead, it somehow made me more unsettled, because it reminded me that the feeling in the apartment the night before hadn't been based on anything solid enough to hold. Just atmosphere, memory, tiny positional details, the kind of things you can't prove even to yourself. That day I barely thought about it while I worked, almost as if my brain had hit some limit and needed to step back. Then at 8:20, as always, I heard the footsteps in the hallway, and for the first time, instead of curiosity, I felt irritation. Not because he had done anything I could point to, but because I was tired of the whole pattern occupying space in my head, so I opened the door again. He was there, walking past. Same backpack, same neutral face, same exact pace. And as he passed, he glanced at the mug I had left visible through the apartment doorway, just for a second, then looked at me and said, "You're up earlier today." I hadn't spoken to him the day before or the day before that. He had no normal reason to comment on my timing. And the thing is, he said it in a completely ordinary tone. Not creepy, not loaded, just casually, like a neighbor making small talk, but my whole body reacted to it. Because it meant he had not only noticed me, he had noticed variations in my routine too. I said, "Yeah, guess so." And he nodded once, then kept walking. I closed the door immediately after, locked it, chained too, then just stood there with that weird cold tension in my chest, because now the awareness was undeniably mutual. He had patterns for me too, that was new. Or maybe it had been true the whole time and I'd only just heard it out loud. That afternoon, I called my friend again and explained the whole thing more clearly. The footsteps, the stairwell, the roof access landing, the look at my door, the chain lock, the comment about me being up earlier. There was a long pause after I finished. Then my friend said very calmly, "Okay, even if this is all still explainable, you need to stop pretending your discomfort doesn't count unless you have courtroom-level proof." That sentence really stuck. Because that was exactly what I had been doing, treating every weird thing like it had to be fully proven before I was allowed to react to it, and that's exhausting. So that evening I made a decision, not a huge one, just practical. I ordered one of those cheap little door sensors and a simple indoor camera. Nothing fancy. Not because I thought something dramatic was about to happen, just because I was tired of not knowing whether the apartment changes I felt were real or not. The camera arrived the next afternoon. I set it up facing the entryway and part of the living room. Again, not hidden, just placed on a shelf. If anyone entered, I wanted to know. That night I went to bed feeling kind of stupid and kind of relieved. Stupid because the whole thing still felt on paper like too little to justify this much tension. Relieved because at least now there would be something objective. Either nothing was happening or something was. And I wouldn't have to keep living in between. The first night with the camera, nothing happened, at least nothing obvious. I woke up, checked the footage, and it was exactly what you'd expect. Me coming in, me moving around, lights going off, nothing else, no door opening, no movement, no unexplained activity, which should have solved everything. That should have been the end of it, because if nothing showed up, then all those small details, the chain, the chair, the blanket, they were just me. Memory errors, fatigue, pattern seeking, that's what I told myself. And honestly, for most of that day, I believed it. The tension dropped almost immediately. I worked normally, didn't listen for footsteps, didn't check the hallway, didn't think about him much at all. Then out of habit more than anything, I checked the camera again that evening, just scrolling through. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't expected. Not a person, not movement, just a time gap. There was a jump in the footage. About 4 minutes missing, right in the middle of the afternoon. No glitch message, no corruption warning, just a clean cut from one moment to another. I sat there for a second, replaying it, back and forth, same thing every time, it skipped. Now again, cameras glitch, cheap ones especially. Connection drops, recording errors, completely normal, so I almost dismissed it immediately. But then I checked the rest of the day. No other gaps, everything else was continuous. Which made that one gap stand out more than it should have. Still, not proof of anything, just one small inconsistency. The next day I left the apartment at around noon. Ran errands, came back around 3. Nothing felt off, camera still in place, everything normal. That night I checked the footage again. Same thing, another gap, different time. This one shorter, maybe 2 minutes. Again, no warning, no visible cause, just missing. And that's when I felt that familiar tension come back, because now there was a pattern again. Not in the hallway, not in his routine, in my own apartment. And this time it was something I could actually point to, not I think something moved. Not this feels different. Something concrete, time missing. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, not to immediately connect it to him, because that leap would be a lot, and there were still plenty of normal explanations. Bad device. Wi-Fi instability, cheap hardware, so the next day I adjusted the setup, moved the camera slightly, checked the connection, reset everything, basically did everything you'd do if you were troubleshooting a normal piece of tech. That night no gaps, full recording, clean, which should have settled it again, and for a few hours it did, until the next morning, 8:20, footsteps. I hadn't been paying attention the day before, but now without even meaning to, I found myself listening again. Same rhythm, same timing, so I opened the door, he was there, walking past, and this time before I said anything, he spoke first. You fixed it. I didn't understand what he meant at first, so I just said, what? He nodded slightly toward my apartment. The camera, my stomach dropped, not dramatically, just that quiet, heavy drop you get when something confirms more than you wanted it to. I said, what about it? He shrugged. Was flickering yesterday. Then he kept walking. Like he hadn't just said anything strange at all. I stood there for a second trying to process that, because there are only a few ways that sentence makes sense, and none of them felt good. He would have had to see inside my apartment, or know where the camera was, or at least have enough awareness of my space to notice something like that, which didn't line up with anything normal. I closed the door slowly, locked it, chain again, then went straight to the camera, checked the angle. From the hallway, unless the door was open, there was no clear line of sight to it, not directly, not enough to notice flickering, and definitely not enough to casually comment on it. That was the moment where everything crossed from this is weird into I don't like this at all. Not because I had proof of something specific, but because now there was a piece of information he shouldn't reasonably have. That changes the entire situation. That afternoon I didn't work much. I just kept replaying that one line in my head. You fixed it. Not what's that. Not did you get a camera. Not curiosity. Familiarity, like it was already part of the environment. That night I checked the footage again. No gaps, everything clean, which somehow made it worse, because now the only irregularities had happened before I reset it and stopped after. Almost like whatever had caused them had stopped too, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those two things were connected. Even if I didn't understand how. After that comment about the camera, I stopped trying to make myself feel stupid for being uncomfortable. That was over, because whether there was a clean explanation or not, I no longer felt like I was reacting to nothing. He knew something about my apartment he shouldn't have casually known. That was enough. So the next day I did something I probably should have done earlier. I made a very simple plan, nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous. I just wanted one straight answer. Either the weirdness would collapse into something normal, or it wouldn't. That evening, before going to bed, I moved the camera again. This time I angled it more directly toward the entryway and left one very obvious detail out of place on purpose, my keys. Usually I dropped them in the little bowl by the door. That night I placed them on the console table beside it, just far enough off that I'd know immediately if they'd been touched. Then I turned off the lights, went to bed, and told myself I was done thinking about it until morning. I barely slept, not because I thought someone was going to break in, just because anticipation is its own kind of tension. When you've spent long enough living in uncertainty, even a small test starts to feel heavier than it should. The next morning, before I even checked the hallway or listened for footsteps, I checked the camera. The footage looked normal at first, me locking up. Silence. Static apartment. Then at 2:13 a.m. the frame changed. Not with the door opening, not with a person entering, just a shift in light. A narrow band of hallway light appeared across the floor near the door, like the door had opened just a few inches and then stopped. My whole body went cold when I saw that, because the camera angle didn't capture the full doorway directly, only part of it and the light spill across the floor. But there it was, a line of light, then shadow, then darkness again. No full entry, no face, no clear person. Just enough to show that the door had not remained fully closed all night. I replayed it over and over. The clip lasted maybe 3 seconds. That was it. 3 seconds of hallway light, partial shadow, and then nothing. I went straight to the door and checked it. Still locked, chain still set from the inside. And for a second I just stood there, staring at it, because the physical reality of that did not match what I had just watched. Then I noticed something else. The keys, they were in the bowl, neatly placed, exactly where I usually leave them. That's the moment I felt actual fear for the first time. Not movie fear, not panic. Just that deep, cold realization that something had happened inside your space while you were asleep and you do not understand how. I checked every window. Locked. Balcony locked. Nothing disturbed. No sign of forced entry. Nothing missing. Nothing broken. Just the keys moved into their correct place. I called my friend immediately. Sent the clip. Sent a photo of the keys. And for the first time since this whole thing started, my friend didn't try to calm me down with some normal explanation right away. They just said, okay, you need to talk to building management now. So I did. I went downstairs that morning and showed the manager the clip. Not the whole story, not the footsteps and the stairwell and the weird packing of everything. Just the simplest version. I set up a camera. My door seems to have opened slightly overnight. Something inside was moved. The manager took it more seriously than I expected. Mostly because of the hour, I think, and because I had video. He asked whether anyone else had access to my unit. No, whether maintenance had entered recently. No scheduled entry, whether the lock had been acting up, not that I knew of. Then he said they could check the hallway cameras. That sentence hit me harder than it should have, because suddenly this wasn't just living in my head anymore. There might actually be an external answer. So I waited in the office while he pulled up the overnight footage, and there he was, 2:13 a.m., the same guy, my neighbor, standing outside my door, not trying to break in, not forcing anything, just standing there, very still, for several seconds. Then he reached toward the handle, not aggressively, just slowly, like he expected something. The manager fast-forwarded slightly. The door opened a small amount, just enough to spill that stripe of hallway light across my floor. Then it stopped, because the chain caught. He stood there looking at the opening for another second or two. Then very calmly, he pushed the door back into place, turned, and walked away. No panic, no rush, no confusion, just left. I stared at that screen and felt completely hollow for a second, because this was the part I hadn't fully let myself believe. Not really, we talk about wanting proof, but sometimes what you actually want is to never get it. The manager asked, "Do you know him?" And I just said, "He lives down the hall." That was all I could manage. Then the manager rewound slightly and said something that made it even worse. He hadn't come from his apartment. He had come from the stairwell, just like I'd thought. At 2:12 he appeared from the stairwell, walked directly to my door, tested it, and went back the same way. No wandering, no hesitation. No sign he'd gone to the wrong apartment. He knew exactly where he was going. That mattered more than anything, because whatever else this was, it wasn't confusion. It wasn't an accident, and once you know that, the whole story changes. After seeing that footage, everything became very simple, not in a comforting way, just clear. Up until that moment, there had always been space for doubt, for explanations. For me to tell myself, I was connecting things that didn't belong together. But once you watch someone walk directly to your door in the middle of the night, and try the handle like they expect it to open, there's not really anything left to reinterpret. The manager asked if I wanted him to call someone. Security, police, something official. And I remember hesitating for a second, which sounds ridiculous now. But in that moment, it didn't feel like something that fit into a clean category. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been broken. Technically, the door hadn't even opened fully. But at the same time, someone had stood outside my apartment at 2 a.m. and tried to come in. That's enough. I said yes. He called building security first, and they came up within maybe 10 minutes. We went back over the footage again. They asked the same basic questions. Did I know him? Had we interacted? Had anything like this happened before? I told them the simple version. He lives down the hall. We've crossed paths a few times. Nothing direct beyond that. I didn't go into the whole pattern. Not the footsteps, not the stairwell, not the way everything had built up. Because trying to explain all of that out loud suddenly felt impossible. Like it would sound less real the more I said it, so I kept it simple. There's video. He tried the door, that's it. They said they'd handle it, which in practical terms meant they went to his apartment and knocked. I didn't go with them. I stayed in mine. Door locked, chain set, camera still on. And I sat there in that very specific kind of silence where your space no longer feels fully yours. About 15 minutes later, one of them came back and told me he had answered the door. Calm. Completely normal, said he had just gone for a walk and must have tried the wrong apartment by mistake. That explanation should have felt insulting, because it didn't match anything I'd seen. Not the way he moved, not the way he walked straight to my door, not the way he left, but instead of getting angry, I just felt tired, because I knew exactly how this would go. Without something more extreme, it stays in that grey area. Mistake, confusion, wrong door, even if it clearly is. He told me they'd logged the incident, that he'd been warned, that if anything else happened it would escalate. Standard response. Nothing dramatic, nothing satisfying, just documented. That same afternoon I bought a second lock, one of those simple internal bars you wedge under the handle, not because I thought he'd come back that night, just because I didn't want to rely on uncertainty anymore. That was the shift. For the rest of the week I stayed somewhere else, just a friend's place across town. Took my laptop essentials, left everything else. Not out of panic, just distance, and during those days something interesting happened. Without the environment, the whole situation started to feel unreal again. Like maybe it had been smaller than it felt, maybe the tension had exaggerated everything. Maybe it really had just been a mistake. That's the thing about space. When you leave it, it takes the feeling with it. But then I came back, unlocked the door, stepped inside. And immediately felt it again. That same subtle awareness. Not that something was happening, just that something had happened there, and that was enough. I stayed another week, nothing else happened. No footsteps at 8:20, no evening packing, no sign of him at all, and that was the strangest part, because the pattern that had been so precise just stopped, completely, like it had never existed. A few days later I saw him once, from a distance, in the parking area, same backpack. Same neutral expression. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, just got into his car and left, and that was the last time I saw him. I asked the manager about it a week after that. He said the guy had given notice, moving out, no details, no explanation, just gone, and that should have been the clean ending. Problem appears, problem gets addressed, problem disappears, but it didn't feel clean because there was never any real explanation, no reason. No clear intention, just a series of small, precise behaviors that built into something real enough to leave an impression. That's the part that stayed with me, not the door, not even the footage, just how long I had lived in that in-between space where everything was explainable until suddenly it was. And if there's anything I took from it, it's this: you don't need something to be extreme to take it seriously. Sometimes something is just consistently off, and that's enough. That's where this one ends. All right that one builds slowly, but once it clicks into place, it changes the whole tone of everything that came before. Now this next story is a different kind of uncomfortable, less about space, more about trust. It starts with a normal situation, letting someone borrow something. Simple favor, nothing serious. And then it turns into one of those situations where you realize the person you trusted doesn't see the situation the same way you do at all. Let's get into the next one. Deyerela kratkoi kakalucha shaya pero de orelja em. Enoveraya este oria. Berolia perize yerem elioen enaya. Enosucha yeren yerize enaka orem yerem chuver este verorem. Yavero deya perorem oge. Arem yerenya per este orias perorel yeri zero verali, backhand index pointing down, so this one is a lot more grounded. No weird timing, no strange patterns, nothing like that, just a normal situation that slowly turns into something frustrating in a very real way. This happened about a year ago when I was still working in an office instead of from home. At the time I had this coworker, I'll call him Jason. We weren't close, but we got along fine. Same team, similar projects, occasional small talk. The kind of workplace relationship where everything is polite, easy, and mostly surface level. Jason was one of those people who always seemed slightly overwhelmed, not in a dramatic way, just always a little behind, a little rushed, a little scattered. Deadlines stressed him out. He'd stay late sometimes, complain about workload, nothing unusual. Everyone has someone like that in their office. At first, I didn't think much of it. If anything, I felt a little bad for him, because when someone constantly looks like they're barely keeping up, your instinct is usually to cut them some slack, and that's exactly how this started. One small favor, that's it. We were both working on separate parts of a campaign for a client. Different responsibilities, but connected enough that we'd occasionally check in with each other. One afternoon, Jason came over to my desk and said, "Hey, quick question, do you have that draft from last week? The social media outline?" I did, so I sent it to him, no hesitation, no big deal. He thanked me, said it helped a lot, and that was it. Completely normal. The next day he came back again. "Hey, can you take a quick look at something for me?" Again, normal. That's part of working in a team. So I looked at it, made a couple of suggestions, nothing major. And again, that should have been the end of it. But it was, because after that it became consistent, not overwhelming at first, just frequent enough to notice. Every couple of days he'd come by with something small. "Can you check this? What do you think about this angle? Does this make sense?" And because each individual request was reasonable, I said yes. Every time. That's how it builds, not through big asks, through small, easy ones that don't feel worth refusing. After about 2 weeks, I started noticing something else. The things he asked me to check weren't really drafts. They were incomplete, like he hadn't actually finished them yet. At first, I assumed he just wanted feedback early, which is fine, but then I realized something. My feedback was turning into the actual work. I wasn't just reviewing, I was rewriting sections, adding structure, fixing ideas, basically turning half-finished pieces into complete ones. And he'd take that and submit it, under his name. Now again, this wasn't obvious at first, because that's how gradual shifts work. It didn't go from small favor to doing his job overnight. It moved in steps, and each step felt just small enough to ignore, until suddenly you're doing more than you agreed to. The moment it really clicked for me was during a team meeting. We were presenting updates on our projects. Jason went first. And as he started talking, I realized something immediately. He was presenting something I had basically built the structure for. Not inspired by, not influenced by, actually built. And the way he presented it, there was no mention of collaboration. No, we worked on this. No, I got help with this. Just his work. That was the first time I felt that slight internal shift, not anger, just recognition. Like, okay, this isn't accidental, because one time could be, but this. This was clean, intentional or not, it was consistent. And once you see that once, you start noticing it everywhere. After that meeting, I started paying closer attention. Not in an aggressive way, just more aware. Because once you notice something like that, it's hard to unsee. The next time Jason came over, I didn't immediately say yes. He had this same relaxed tone. Hey, can you just take a look at this real quick? And I remember thinking how familiar that phrasing had become. Real quick, every time, like it was designed to feel small, temporary, not worth thinking about. I said, sure, but this time I didn't jump into it right away. I looked at what he had. And again, it wasn't done, not even close. It was more like a rough outline with a few bullet points and half-formed ideas. The kind of thing that still needed real work. And I caught myself almost automatically starting to fix it. Rewriting sentences, restructuring parts, making it clearer. Then I stopped, midway, just stopped, and that pause felt weird. Because up until then I hadn't really questioned the process, I just filled in the gaps. So instead of continuing, I said, yeah, this looks like a good start, you just need to flesh it out a bit more. And I handed it back. That was the first time I didn't complete something for him. Did it for a second, then at me. Not confused, more like recalibrating. Then he said, yeah, I just wasn't sure how to structure it. That line stood out immediately, because that's exactly what I had been doing for him. Structure, not just feedback, actual construction. So I said I'd just expand each section and connect the ideas more clearly. Simple, general, nothing specific enough to do the work for him. He nodded, said, got it, and went back to his desk. That interaction was small, but it shifted something, because for the first time I didn't fill the gap, and I could feel even in that moment that he noticed it. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. He still came by, still asked for quick looks. But I kept my responses minimal, surface level, feedback, not solutions. And that's when something interesting started happening. The quality of what he brought to me didn't improve, it just stayed incomplete. Which told me something important. He wasn't asking for help because he needed guidance. He was asking because he expected completion. That's a big difference. One is collaboration, the other is delegation without acknowledgement. A week later, we had another meeting. Jason presented again. This time the work was noticeably weaker. Not terrible, just unfinished, less polished, less structured, and I could see it in the room, the way people reacted. The way the manager asked more follow-up questions. The way Jason hesitated slightly when explaining parts. Nothing dramatic, but enough to register. And for the first time I realized how much I had been smoothing things out for him. Not just helping, carrying. That thought stuck with me more than anything else. Because once you realize you've been carrying part of someone else's responsibility, it changes how you see every previous interaction. The quick checks, the small favors, the casual tone. It all looks different in hindsight. A few days later he came by again. Same tone, same phrasing. Hey, can you take a look at this? And this time I said, I'm kind of swamped right now, so probably not. That wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. I just didn't want to do it, and saying that felt uncomfortable. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because it broke the pattern. He paused for a second, then said, oh, okay, and walked away. Pause was important, because it was the first real sign of expectation not being met. Not anger, not frustration, just adjustment. That's when I realized something. Up until that point, I hadn't actually set a boundary. I had just slowly reduced involvement. But now I had clearly said no, and once you do that, you find out very quickly what kind of dynamic you were actually in. After that first no, things didn't explode. There was no confrontation, no awkward scene. Which honestly made it more uncomfortable, because everything stayed polite. On the surface, nothing had changed. We still said hi, still had normal conversations. But underneath that, the dynamic had shifted, and you could feel it. The next couple of days, Jason didn't come over at all, which at first felt like a relief. Like maybe that was all it took, just one boundary and everything resets. But then about 3 days later, he came back. Same tone, same casual approach. A quick thing, can you just glance at this? I paused, because now I knew exactly what this was. Not a question, a test, to see if the old pattern was still available. And the important thing about patterns like this is that they don't disappear after one no. They check, they adjust, they try again, so I said, I can't right now. Again simple, no long explanation. He nodded, said yeah, no worries. But this time there was something slightly different in his expression, not irritation. Not obvious, just tighter, like he was holding back a reaction. That was the first hint that this hadn't been as neutral as it looked before, because when someone genuinely sees your help as optional, they don't react to losing it, but when they see it as part of their process, even small resistance stands out. Over the next week I noticed something else. He started asking other people, not directly in front of me, but you could see it, him going desk to desk, same phrasing, same tone. Quick look, just a second. And at first it worked, because of course it did. That's how these things work. Everyone says yes the first time, maybe the second, maybe even the third. But here's the thing, not everyone fills in the gaps the same way. Some people give actual feedback, some people just skim, some people don't engage deeply, which meant the output stayed inconsistent, and that inconsistency started showing up more clearly, during meetings, in project reviews. In the way his work was received, not in a dramatic way, just gradually, less confidence from management, more follow-up questions, more corrections needed after the fact, and through all of that I stayed out of it, not intentionally isolating him, just no longer stepping in, which for the first time let me see the situation from the outside instead of being part of it, and from the outside it looked very different. It didn't look like collaboration. It looked like someone trying to outsource thinking, in small, deniable ways. That realization made me feel two things at the same time, relief and irritation. Relief because I had stepped out of it, irritation because I hadn't noticed it sooner. A few days later something happened that made everything very clear. We were in another team meeting. Jason was presenting again, and about halfway through our manager stopped him, not aggressively, just directly. Can you walk me through how you got to this structure? That question matters, because it forces ownership. For a second, Jason hesitated, just slightly. Then he started explaining, but it wasn't clean, not confident, not structured. You could hear it, the way the explanation didn't fully match the work, and that's when the room shifted, not dramatically, just enough. That subtle change where people start paying closer attention, where something doesn't fully line up, and once that happens. To undo. After the meeting I didn't say anything to him, didn't need to, because at that point the situation had started to correct itself. Not because I exposed it, not because I confronted him. Just because the system he was using no longer worked without someone consistently feeding it. And that's when I understood something really clearly. I hadn't just been helping. I had been part of the structure that made his approach possible. Once I stepped out, the structure weakened. On its own, a few days after that meeting, my manager asked me to come in for a quick check-in. Nothing unusual. We had those every couple of weeks. Just a basic review, how things are going, what I'm working on, any issues, that kind of thing. I went in expecting a normal conversation, and at first it was. We talked about my current projects, timelines, a couple of upcoming campaigns. Then halfway through, she paused and said something that immediately shifted the tone. I want to ask you something a bit more specific. That's always the moment where you know the conversation isn't just routine anymore. She continued, I've noticed some inconsistencies in how work has been coming through on the team. She didn't mention Jason's name right away, which told me she was being careful, trying to understand before assuming. Then she said, on some of the projects, I've seen ideas and structures that feel familiar, but the attribution doesn't always match. I knew exactly what she meant, but I didn't say anything immediately, because this is the tricky part. You don't want to sound like you're complaining, you don't want to throw someone under the bus, but you also don't want to pretend nothing is happening, so I kept it neutral. I said, what do you mean? She leaned back slightly and said, I'm seeing similar approaches show up in different places, but they're being presented by different people in ways that don't fully line up. That was as direct as she was going to be without namming it, and honestly it was enough, so I answered carefully. I've collaborated with people on things before, but recently I've been focusing more on my own work. That was true, but it didn't fully explain the situation. She nodded slowly, then said, have you ever felt like your contributions weren't being fully represented? That question landed, because now it was direct, still professional, still calm, but direct. And this was the moment where I had to decide whether to stay vague or actually say something real. So I said, there were times earlier on where I'd help shape things, and then those ideas would show up later without much context. I didn't say Jason's name, I didn't give examples. I just described the pattern. She didn't interrupt, just listened. Then she asked, did you address it at the time? And I said no, because I hadn't. And saying that out loud made something very clear to me in that moment. I hadn't just been helping, I had been allowing the situation to continue by not acknowledging it, not intentionally, but still. She nodded again and said, okay, that helps. That was it, no immediate reaction, no visible judgment, just processing. Then she shifted the conversation back to normal topics. Deadlines, priorities, next steps, but the tone had changed. Subtly, and I could feel it, because now the situation existed outside of just me noticing it. It was on her radar, and once something like that reaches that level, it doesn't stay hidden for long. The next few days were quiet, no big meetings, no direct conversations, but the atmosphere on the team felt slightly different. More attention to detail. More questions during reviews. More focus on who did what, and that's when I realized something important. Accountability doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from visibility. Once people start looking more closely, patterns that were easy to ignore become harder to maintain. And Jason was starting to feel that. You could see it. In the way he presented things, in how careful he suddenly became with wording, in how often he referenced team input instead of presenting things as fully his. Small adjustments, but noticeable, and that told me everything I needed to know. He knew the situation had shifted too. The turning point didn't come from a confrontation. No one stood up in a meeting and called anything out. No dramatic "this is my work" moment. It came from something much quieter. And because of that, it hit harder. We had a larger client presentation coming up, not internal. External, important enough that everything had to be clean, clear, and well supported. The kind of project where people pay attention to details. Real details, not just the surface. Jason was assigned a major part of it, a full strategy segment, and I remember noticing that immediately, because it meant one thing: he couldn't rely on quick input from others in the same way. This had to hold up on its own. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. He was working, meeting deadlines. No obvious issues, but then about halfway through the prep phase, I started noticing something familiar. He came by my desk again, same tone, same phrasing. "Hey, quick thought, what would you do here?" That sentence mattered, because it was "can you check this?" It was "what would you do?" Direct, not even framed as feedback anymore. I looked at the document, and it was the same pattern: incomplete structure, loose ideas, nothing fully built out, just pieces waiting to be connected. And for a split second, I felt that old instinct kick in, to fix it, to organize it, to make it work, because it's easier, it's faster. And honestly, it feels good in the moment. But then I stopped, and instead I said, "I think you just need to develop it more." And that was it. No specifics, no structure, no solution. He stared at the screen for a second, then at me, then said, "Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm going in the right direction." That line again. The same soft framing. So I said, "You probably are, just build it out." And I went back to my work. That was the moment everything locked in, because there was no ambiguity anymore. He wasn't asking for collaboration, he was asking for direction, and without that, he didn't have a clear path. Over the next week, the pressure increased. Deadlines got closer, reviews got stricter, and you could see the gap widening, not dramatically, just consistently. His section wasn't coming together the way it needed to. It wasn't terrible, it just wasn't solid. And in that kind of setting, not solid is very noticeable. The day before the presentation, we had a final internal run-through. Everyone presented their parts, polished, structured, clear. Then Jason went, and within the first few minutes it was obvious. The flow wasn't there. The logic didn't fully connect. There were gaps, and more importantly, when questions came up, the answers weren't clean. Not because he didn't try, but because the foundation wasn't his, not really. And when you don't fully own the structure of something, it shows under pressure. The room didn't react dramatically. No one called it out harshly, but the tone shifted. More questions, more pauses, more clarification needed, and then my manager stepped in. Again calm, professional, but direct. "Let's walk through this step by step." And as she did that, something became very clear to everyone in the room. Not because it was said out loud, but because it didn't need to be. He couldn't fully explain the logic behind the work, not cleanly, not confidently. And that's when the pattern finally became visible at the surface level, not as an accusation, as a gap between presentation and ownership. After that run-through, the plan changed. Parts of his section were reassigned, some things were simplified, other parts were redistributed, including some of it coming to me, which ironically brought everything full circle. Except this time it was transparent, clear, acknowledged, not hidden behind quick looks, and that's what made the difference. After that run-through, the energy on the team was different, not tense, just clarified. Everyone knew what had happened. No one needed to say it out loud. And because of that, everything became more direct. Work was reassigned without drama. Deadlines were tightened. People focused on their own sections more clearly. And for the first time in a while, there was no ambiguity about who was responsible for what. That alone made things feel lighter. But I knew there was still one conversation that hadn't happened yet. And it happened later that same day. I was at my desk, wrapping up a few things when Jason came over. No hey, no casual tone this time, just "Can we talk for a second?" That was new. I said, "Yeah." We stepped into one of the smaller meeting rooms, closed the door, and for a second neither of us said anything. Then he started. "I feel like something changed. Not defensive, not aggressive, just direct." I said, "What do you mean?" And he looked at me like he was choosing his words carefully. "Before you used to help more." There it was, not framed as a problem, just stated. But the implication was clear. Something had been available, and now it was. I said, "I still help when I can." Which was true, just not in the same way anymore. He nodded slightly, then said, "Yeah, but before it was easier to run things by you." That word again. Easier, not better, not clearer. Easier. And that's when the whole situation clicked into a single, simple understanding. For him, this had never been about collaboration. It had been about efficiency, using available input to reduce his own workload. And because I had made that input consistently available, it became part of his process. Not something extra, something expected. I said, "I think I was doing more than just helping." He didn't respond immediately, just looked at me, so I continued. I was basically building parts of things for you, and that's not really sustainable. There was a pause, then he said, I didn't think of it that way, and I actually believed him, not because it made it okay, but because that's how these situations usually work. It doesn't feel like taking when it happens gradually, it just feels like using what's there. He added, I just thought we were working things out together. That line mattered, because from his perspective, maybe that's what it looked like. Two people refining ideas, back and forth, but the reality was different, because the effort wasn't balanced. And over time, that imbalance became invisible to him. I said if it was back and forth, it would be different, but most of the time, I was filling in gaps. He nodded slowly, didn't argue, didn't push back, which told me he understood, at least partially. Then he said something that stuck with me. I guess I got used to it. That was the most honest thing he could have said. No justification, no excuse, just acknowledgement. And that's what made the whole conversation feel real, because now it wasn't about whether he meant to do it. It was about the fact that he had. And once something becomes a habit, it stops feeling like a choice. I said that's kind of the issue. And we just sat there for a second, not awkward, just quiet. Then he said, I'll figure it out. Simple, no drama, no resentment, just acceptance. And honestly, that was enough. After that conversation, things didn't reset overnight. There was no clean switch from old dynamic to everything fixed. It shifted, gradually. But this time, Vederigeri Uester Orenu. Jason stopped coming over completely, not just less often, not at all, no more quick looks. No more what do you think? Nothing. At first that felt like relief, like the boundary had worked exactly as intended. Clear line right arrow behavior changes right arrow problem solved, but after a few days something else became noticeable. The distance, not dramatic, not hostile, just distance. Conversations became shorter, more transactional. Hey, that file, updated. Got it, that was it, no casual comments. No shared moments about work, nothing beyond what was strictly necessary. And again, no one said anything about it, but you could feel it, because before, even if the dynamic wasn't balanced, there was still a kind of flow. Now there was, it was clean, but it was also cold, and that's the part people don't really talk about with boundaries. Sometimes when you fix the imbalance, you also remove the connection that existed around it, even if that connection wasn't entirely healthy. A week later, we had another internal meeting. Smaller this time, just team updates. Jason presented again, and this time something was different, not perfect, not suddenly amazing, but that was the key difference. The structure was simpler, the ideas were less polished, but the explanation was clear, direct, owned, and when questions came up he answered them, not perfectly, but confidently enough. Because now the work actually matched his understanding of it, and that's something you can't fake. Watching that, I felt something I didn't expect, not satisfaction, not validation, just neutrality. Because at that point, the situation had corrected itself, without conflict, without escalation, just through removing one piece that didn't belong there anymore. After the meeting, he passed by my desk and said, that went better. I nodded and said, yeah, it did, and that was it. No reference to the conversation we had, no revisiting anything, just acknowledgement of the present, which honestly felt like the right way to leave it. Over the next few weeks, things stabilized. We worked on separate parts, occasionally synced when necessary, but the interaction stayed balanced. No hidden expectations, no quiet overreach, just normal collaboration. And that's what made everything feel resolved, not perfectly, not in a we're close now kind of way, but in a stable, functional way. And sometimes that's better. Looking back on it now, nothing about that situation was extreme. No arguments, no HR involvement, no big confrontation. From outside, that one is very real. No mystery, no hidden element, just one of those situations that builds slowly because nobody stops it early enough. For the next story, we're going back into something more unsettling again. This one starts with something small, just a neighbor, a shared space, and a routine that seems completely normal. But over time, it turns into one of those situations where you realize someone is paying attention to you in a way that doesn't feel accidental anymore. Let's get into it. So this one started with something I didn't even register at first. Just a normal apartment building thing. Shared parking, that's it. Nothing unusual about that. I had been living in that place for a few months already. Not long enough to know everyone, but long enough to recognize faces. You start noticing people without really thinking about it. Same cars, same routines, same general flow of who comes and goes. My parking spot was in the underground garage, assigned, nothing fancy, just a numbered space like everyone else. And right next to mine was always the same car, dark blue, older model, nothing that stands out. It blended in, the kind of car you'd forget immediately after looking at it. At first, I didn't think about it at all. It was just there, parked when I parked, gone when I left, normal. But after a while, I started noticing something small. Again, always something small. The timing. No matter when I went down to the garage, that car was either already there or pulling in. Not sometimes, not often, every time, morning, evening, random afternoon, late night, it didn't matter. The overlap was always there. At first, I brushed it off, because shared schedules happen. People work similar hours, use their cars at similar times, that's normal. But then it started getting precise. One night I went down really late, like past midnight. I had forgotten something in my car, didn't expect to see anyone. The garage was almost empty, quiet, echoing, and as I reached my car I heard an engine, then headlights. That same dark blue car slowly pulled in. Parked next to mine, at 12:40 a.m. That stuck with me, not because it was impossible, but because it matched the pattern too perfectly. So the next day I tested something, left at a different time, earlier than usual, no predictable schedule, and as I walked into the garage there it was, already parked, engine still warm like it had just arrived. Again, that's when I started paying attention more deliberately, not obsessively, just tracking it in the back of my mind. Over the next week the pattern held. No matter when I went down that car was there, or arriving, never gone for long, never out of sync. And the thing that really made it stand out was that I never saw the driver, not once, not getting out, not getting in, just the car moving, existing, appearing, but never the person attached to it. And at first I told myself, you're just missing it, timing, angles, normal stuff. But after enough repetitions, that explanation started feeling thin. Because statistically you should catch someone eventually, even by accident, but I didn't. And that's when the situation shifted from, we have similar routines, to, this overlap is too consistent to be random. After about a week of noticing the car, I decided to do something very simple. I was just going to see the driver, that was it. Because once you attach a normal person to a strange pattern, the pattern usually becomes less strange. That was my logic anyway. So one evening, instead of parking and heading straight to the elevator, I stayed in the garage for a minute, just stood by my car, checked my phone, pretended to be busy, waited, and a few seconds later I heard it, that same engine. Same slow turn into the row, same blue car. It pulled in beside mine and parked like always. I stayed where I was, and for a second I actually felt kind of relieved, because now I'd finally see who it was. The engine turned off, the headlights went dark. I waited, nothing, no door opening, no movement inside, so I glanced over. The windows were tinted just enough that I couldn't see clearly from where I was standing, not blackout dark, just enough to blur shapes. I waited maybe 10 more seconds. Still nothing. That's when it started feeling weird. Because even if someone is just sitting for a second after parking, eventually there's some movement, a door unlock, a light inside the car, a silhouette shifting, anything, but there was nothing. I told myself not to be strange about it. Walked around to the trunk of my own car like I was grabbing something, gave it a few more seconds, still nothing. Then, trying to keep it casual, I looked directly through the driver's side window as I passed. No one was in the car. I actually stopped for half a second, not dramatically, just enough for the realization to land. Empty, completely empty. Now, obviously, there are explanations for that. The simplest one is that the driver got out on the other side before I noticed. But the problem with that is, the passenger side was against the wall. Not close enough to block a door completely, but close enough that getting out there would have been awkward and loud. And I had been standing right there. I would have heard it or seen it, something, but I didn't. I looked around the garage. No footsteps, no elevator sound, no closing door, just me, my car. And the empty blue car parked beside it like it had arrived by itself. That was the first moment I felt actual discomfort. Not fear, not panic, just that cold little internal shift where a situation stops being mildly odd and becomes personally unsettling. I got into the elevator immediately after that, didn't linger. Didn't check the car again, just left. That night I replayed it in my head over and over, trying to make it reasonable. Maybe the driver slipped past while I was looking down. Maybe someone got out earlier than I realized. Maybe I was more distracted than I thought. All of that was possible, still possible, but the feeling remained, because the whole thing had happened in such a small enclosed space, and it hadn't felt missable. The next day I tried to ignore it, seriously. Told myself I wasn't going to turn some random garage coincidence into a personal mystery. Then that evening I came home around 6:30, drove into the garage, and there it was, the blue car, already parked, same spot. No big deal, except this time as I got out of my car I noticed something taped under the corner of my windshield. Not on the glass, tucked near the wiper, a small square of folded paper. My stomach dropped immediately, because whatever normal explanations existed for the timing, for the overlap, for the empty car, none of them included paper on my windshield. I pulled it off, unfolded it, and it was blank, no writing, nothing printed, just a plain square of white paper folded once. I stood there staring at it for a second, feeling ridiculous and tense at the same time, because what are you even supposed to do with that? A blank note means nothing. It could have been stuck there by accident, trash, a random piece of paper blown into the garage, anything except it was folded, neatly, and tucked in place. That doesn't happen by accident. I looked around the garage, no one there, just that same blue car beside mine, silent as always. I got back into my own car for a second just to think, and while I was sitting there I noticed something else. The blue car's side mirror was angled slightly toward my driver's side door. Not in a dramatic way, not like a camera, just positioned, and I know how that sounds, I do. It sounds like the kind of detail you only notice once you're already on edge. That's probably true, but once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. Everything about the car felt just a little too aware of mine. I ended up taking the paper upstairs with me, left it on the kitchen counter, and for the rest of the night I kept glancing at it like it might suddenly explain itself. It didn't, it was just paper. But the real problem wasn't the paper. It was what it meant, because now the pattern in the garage had touched my car directly. And that made it harder to keep pretending this was all just weird timing. After the note, I stopped treating the situation as something abstract. Before it was just a pattern. Now it had crossed into something physical, something that had directly interacted with my space, and that changes how you think about it. The next morning I didn't go straight to work. I went to the building office, not in a panic, just practical. Because if something is happening in a shared space, there's usually at least one place you can check: cameras. The building had them in the garage. I'd seen them before. Nothing fancy, just standard coverage. So I asked the manager a simple question. Hey, is there any way to check the garage cameras from last night? He looked at me a little confused and said, "What for?" And this is where it gets awkward. Because when something feels off but you don't have a clean explanation, it's hard to present it without sounding like you're overreacting. So I kept it simple. I think someone might have been near my car. That was technically true. He didn't push, just said, "Yeah, we can take a look." So we went into the office, pulled up the footage, and scrolled back to the time I got home. 6:30 p.m. You could see my car entering the garage, parking, me getting out, all normal. Then the blue car already there, parked, engine off, no movement. The manager fast-forwarded, rewound, checked a few minutes earlier, and that's when something immediately stood out. The blue car had appeared in the footage without entering. No frame of it driving in, no headlights turning the corner, no moment where it pulled into the spot. It was just there, between one frame and the next. I leaned forward slightly, thinking maybe I had missed something, so we rewound again. Slower this time. Frame by frame, my car enters, empty space next to it. Next frame, the blue car is parked there, fully positioned like it had always been there. The manager paused, looked at me, then at the screen again, and said, "That's probably just a recording skip." That was the logical answer. Same as the camera gaps in my apartment before. Small systems glitch, frames drop, things appear out of sequence. That's normal, but it didn't feel normal. Because now I had two separate systems showing similar inconsistencies. My apartment camera missing time. Garage camera missing arrival. Individually both explainable, together harder to ignore. I didn't say anything dramatic, just nodded and said, "Yeah, probably." Because what else are you going to say in that situation? There's a limit to how far you can push something without sounding like you've already decided what it means. We kept watching. At around 6:29 the footage showed my car again, and something else. The windshield, no paper. Then the footage jumped forward slightly, only a second or two. And suddenly the paper was there, already tucked under the wiper, no visible hand placing it, no person approaching, just present again, same explanation available, dropped frames, missed motion, nothing conclusive, but it followed the same pattern, something happens and the exact moment it happens is missing. That consistency was the problem, not the events themselves, the absence around them. We watched a bit longer, nothing else unusual, no one approaching the car, no one lingering nearby, just normal garage movement, people coming and going, doors opening, elevator lights, everything except the parts I needed to see. Eventually the manager shrugged and said, "Looks like just a glitch." And again I agreed, because I didn't have anything stronger than that. Not in a way that could be explained out loud. I went back upstairs after that, sat in my apartment for a while, and realized something that I hadn't fully admitted yet. Even if every single detail had a normal explanation, the combination of them didn't feel normal anymore. Not to me. And that matters more than people think. Because at some point, it stops being about proving something, and starts being about whether you feel comfortable in your own space. That's when I decided to change something. Not confront anything, not escalate, just observe more deliberately. That night I went down to the garage again. Not to park, just to check. The blue car was there, of course it was. Same spot, same stillness. And this time, instead of leaving quickly, I walked around it slowly. Not touching, just looking, trying to catch something I had missed before, and then I saw it, the driver's seat, pushed all the way back. Further than most people would sit comfortably, and for a second that didn't mean anything. Then I realized, if someone had been driving that car recently, they would have had to adjust the seat forward unless they were unusually tall, which again, possible. But the more I looked at the car, the more it felt like something that existed just slightly outside normal use. Not abandoned, not broken, just wrong in small, consistent ways. And once you start noticing that kind of detail, you can't go back to not noticing. After that night in the garage, I tried to step back, not physically, mentally, because there's a point where attention starts feeding the situation, where the more you look, the more you find, and I didn't want to turn every small detail into something bigger than it was. So for a couple of days I kept things normal, parked, went upstairs, didn't linger, didn't check the car, didn't look at the mirrors or the seat or anything else. Just routine. And for a while that worked. The tension dropped a little, not gone, but quieter. Then something happened that pulled it all back again. It was late afternoon. I had come back from work a bit earlier than usual, around 5 instead of my normal 6:30. The garage was quieter than usual at that time, less movement, less noise, and when I pulled in, the blue car wasn't there. That was the first time since I had started noticing it. Empty space, same spot, nothing in it. And I remember feeling this weird mix of relief and something else, because on one hand it broke the pattern, which should have made everything feel less rigid, less fixed. But on the other hand, it made me aware of how predictable everything had been before, enough that its absence felt noticeable. I parked, got out, walked toward the elevator, and for the first time in a while I didn't feel that low-level tension. No overlapping presence, no quiet expectation of movement, just an empty garage that should have been the end of it for the day. But as I stood waiting for the elevator, I heard it. An engine, slow, familiar. I turned slightly and watched the blue car pull into the garage, right on cue, except now it was arriving after me, which had never happened before. It came down the ramp, turned into the row, and parked in the same spot beside my car, exactly like every other time. I stood there longer than I should have, not trying to hide it, just watching. The engine turned off, lights went out, silence, same as before. No one got out, no movement, nothing, and that's when the feeling shifted again. Because before the pattern had been passive, overlap, timing, coincidence stretched too far, now it felt reactive. Like my presence had been registered and the pattern adjusted around it. That's a very different feeling. I got into the elevator without waiting any longer, went upstairs, closed the door, locked it. And for the first time since this started, I didn't immediately try to rationalize it. I just sat there and let the discomfort exist. Because at that point, I had already gone through every normal explanation I could think of, and none of them fully covered what I was experiencing anymore. That night, I kept thinking about one specific detail, the timing of the arrival, not just that it happened, but that it happened after I got there, after the pattern had been broken for the first time. And that's what made it feel intentional, even if I couldn't prove it, even if there was some completely normal explanation behind it. The feeling itself had changed, from coincidence to awareness. The next day I decided to test one more thing, nothing extreme, just a small variation. Instead of parking in my assigned spot, I parked 2 rows over. A guest spot, not something I usually did, but still allowed. Then I walked up like normal, didn't linger, didn't look back, just left. About 10 minutes later I went back down, not because I needed to, just to check. And there it was, the blue car, parked in the spot next to where my car normally was. Not next to where I had parked that day. Next to the empty space where my car usually would be. That was the moment everything became very clear. Not in terms of explanation, but in terms of pattern. Whatever was happening, it wasn't tied to the parking spot. It was tied to me. And once you realize that, the whole situation feels very different. Once I realized the pattern followed my car and not the parking space, something in me shifted. Because up until then, even with all the weirdness, part of me could still treat it like an environmental thing. A strange overlap, a garage routine, a coincidence stretched too far. But if the blue car was orienting itself around my presence instead of a fixed location, that was different. That felt personal, not necessarily dangerous, but personal. And once something starts feeling personal, it gets under your skin much faster. The next couple of days, I didn't do any more tests. No switching spots, no lingering, no staring at the car. I just parked, went upstairs, and tried to keep my attention off it. But now that I had seen the pattern clearly, it was impossible to fully go back. I found myself listening for the elevator longer than usual, checking the hallway peephole for no reason, not because I had seen anything there, just because the sense of overlap had expanded. It no longer felt confined to the garage. Then on the 3rd day after that, something happened that made that feeling worse. I was walking back from a grocery store about 6 blocks from my building, not my usual route. I had taken a longer way home because the weather was decent and I didn't feel like going straight back. I had one bag in each hand, headphones in, wasn't really paying attention to much beyond traffic and the sidewalk. Then as I was crossing a smaller side street, I heard a car brake lightly near the curb. Not hard. Just enough to register. I glanced over without thinking, and there it was, the blue car, same model, same color, same worn edge on the front bumper I'd started noticing in the garage, parked at the curb with the engine running. For half a second I genuinely froze, not in some cinematic way, just that brief full-body pause when your brain recognizes something where it absolutely did not expect to. The windows were up, tinted the same way. I couldn't see clearly inside. And before I could decide whether I was even sure it was the same car, it pulled away. Slowly, no sudden move, no dramatic acceleration, just merged into traffic and kept going. Now, obviously, that could still mean nothing. Cars exist outside garages. People drive around the same neighborhood. There are only so many dark blue older model sedans in the world, all true, but after everything else, seeing that car outside the building made the pattern feel looser, more immobile. Less containable, and that's what bothered me. That night I stood at the kitchen window for a while longer than usual, not looking for anything specific, just aware, trying to settle myself back into normality, and then I caught myself doing something I really didn't like. I was mentally inventorying which details made it probably the same car. The bumper, the tint, the shape of the headlights, the timing. That's when I realized how deeply this had already gotten into my head. Because now even when the car wasn't there, I was organizing my thoughts around the possibility of it. That's exhausting. The next morning I went down to the garage and the blue car was there again. Same spot, same stillness. And for the first time, instead of discomfort, I felt anger. Not huge, not explosive. Just that tired irritation that comes from something taking up more of your attention than it deserves. So I did something I hadn't done yet. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the license plate. Not because I had some elaborate plan, just because I wanted something concrete, something fixed. Proof that the car was real, that I wasn't somehow blurring details together in my head. Then I went to work. Later that afternoon, I looked at the photo again, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The license plate in the image was slightly blurred, not all of it, just the center. The first 2 characters were readable. The last 2 were readable. The middle looked smeared in a way that didn't match motion blur or bad focus. I checked the rest of the image. My car was sharp, the wall was sharp, the floor lines were sharp, only the middle of the plate looked wrong. I zoomed in. Same result. Now yes, phone cameras do weird things. Compression artifacts, glare, digital sharpening, all that stuff, I know. But again, this wasn't happening by itself. It was happening on top of everything else. And that's what made it unbearable. Not one weird photo. A weird photo inside an already weird pattern. That night, I texted the picture to my friend. They called me almost immediately and said, very calmly, "Okay, I don't care whether there's still a normal explanation for all of this. You need to stop treating this like a puzzle and start treating it like something you don't want around you." That sentence landed hard, because they were right. I had still been behaving like if I could just understand the pattern, I'd feel better. But maybe understanding wasn't the point anymore. Maybe distance was, and that's when I started thinking seriously about telling building management the whole story. Not just the note, not just the odd camera skips, not just the garage footage, all of it, because separately every piece looked thin. Together, they told a much more uncomfortable story. The next morning, I went straight to the building office again. This time I didn't keep it simple. I didn't try to make it sound normal, I just explained everything. The garage timing, the empty car, the note, the camera skips, the car appearing outside, the license plate photo, all of it. Saying it out loud felt strange. Because when you list things like that one after another, it starts to sound like something bigger than you're comfortable claiming. But I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, I just wanted someone else to hear it. The manager listened. Didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss it, just let me finish. Then he sat back for a second and said, "Okay," not skeptical, not convinced, just processing. Then he asked, "You said the car is always parked next to yours?" I said yes. He nodded slowly and turned his monitor slightly. "Let's check something." He pulled up a list of assigned parking spaces. Scrolled down, found mine, then the one next to it, and said, "That spot isn't assigned right now." That caught me off guard, because that meant the car didn't belong there permanently. It wasn't someone's fixed space. It was just choosing that spot every time. He scrolled further, checked recent parking registrations, then said, "We don't have that plate in the system." That made sense. Not everyone registers their car, but it added to the pattern. Nothing fixed, nothing officially tied, just presence. Then he paused for a second longer than before and said, "You're not the first person to mention that car." That sentence landed immediately, because now the whole situation shifted again. From "this is something happening to me" to "this has happened before," I said, "What do you mean?" He leaned back slightly and said, "Nothing like what you described exactly. Just a few people over the past months asking about a car that's always around." I felt that same cold drop again. Because that meant the pattern wasn't new, it wasn't random. It had a history. I asked, "Did anything come of that?" He shook his head. No complaints, just questions, people noticing it. That made sense, because what I had experienced, even at its most uncomfortable, still sat right on that edge where it's hard to formally report. Nothing directly wrong, just consistently off. Then he added something else. "We've never seen anyone clearly tied to it." That matched my experience exactly. The car existed, moved, appeared, but the person behind it stayed just out of reach. And that's what made it feel so unsettling. If there had been a clear driver, a face, a normal interaction, it probably would have collapsed into something ordinary. But there was just the pattern. The manager said they could flag it, keep an eye on the garage cameras more actively. But again, nothing immediate, nothing actionable, because technically nothing had happened. That's the frustrating part. The line where something becomes officially a problem is much further than where it starts to feel like one. I thanked him and went back upstairs. And for the first time since all of this started, I didn't feel confused. I felt certain. Not about what it was, but about one thing. This wasn't just me noticing something random. This had been happening. Quietly, repeatedly, to more than one person, and that changed everything, because now it wasn't about interpretation, it was about pattern. And patterns don't just disappear on their own. The thing about uncertainty is that part of you starts wanting a direct answer, not because you think it'll be good, just because anything feels easier than that long, stretched-out space of maybe. Maybe it's random, maybe it's not, maybe you're overreacting, maybe you're not. That kind of tension wears you down. So after the conversation with the manager, I made a decision, not a dramatic one. I wasn't going to bang on doors or wait in the garage for hours or do anything reckless. I was just done pretending that if I ignored it long enough, it would settle itself. If the car was there again and if I had the chance, I was going to stay, not watch from a distance, not leave quickly, just stay and see what happened. That evening I came home a little earlier than usual, around 5:45. The garage was quieter than normal but not empty, one other car a few rows over. Faint hum from the lights overhead, that same heavy indoor stillness garages always have. And there it was, the blue car, in the unassigned spot beside mine, already parked, already still. I pulled in, turned off my engine, and just sat there for a second with both hands still on the steering wheel, not psyching myself up, just letting myself commit to staying. Then I got out, locked my car, and instead of walking to the elevator, I leaned against the concrete pillar near my spot and waited. First, nothing happened. No movement, no door opening, no interior light in the blue car, just silence. I looked at my phone for a minute, mostly to keep myself from feeling ridiculous. Then I looked up again, still nothing. 5 minutes passed, maybe 6, long enough that I started feeling stupid again. Like, of course nothing's going to happen. Of course you've built this into something bigger than it is. Then the driver's side door opened, slowly, not abruptly, just a clean, controlled motion. A man stepped out, mid-30s maybe, average height, dark jacket, nothing especially memorable about him except how completely ordinary he looked. That's what caught me first. Not creepy looking, not disheveled, not intense, just normal. He closed the door, turned, saw me standing there and paused for maybe half a second. Not startled, not guilty, just aware. Then he said, "You're home early." That was the first thing he said to me. Not hey, not sorry. Not even can I help you. Just a comment about my timing. And hearing that out loud did something cold to my stomach. Because it confirmed the thing I had been trying not to say too plainly. He had a pattern for me. He knew when I was usually there. I straightened up and said, "I could say the same thing to you." He looked at me for a second, then gave this tiny, almost unreadable smile, not friendly, not mocking exactly, just private, and said, "I guess you could." That was the moment I realized I wasn't going to get anything normal from this interaction. No accidental neighbor energy, no "oh, funny coincidence," nothing that collapsed the situation back into ordinary life. So I said, "Do you live in the building?" And even asking that felt strange because of course he might. That would be the most normal possibility. But he didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, then said, sometimes, that word again, small enough to evade meaning. Clear enough to be intentional. I said, "What does that mean?" He shrugged lightly and glanced toward the elevator like he had nowhere urgent to be. "It means I'm around." That answer irritated me immediately, not because it was threatening, because it was slippery. The whole interaction felt like that, not aggressive, not openly hostile, just angled in a way that refused clarity, so I asked something more direct. "Why's your car always next to mine?" He actually looked at the cars then. Then back at me and said, "That's where the space is," which on paper is a perfectly reasonable answer, except it wasn't always where the space was, and we both knew that. I said, "That spot isn't assigned." He nodded once. "Exactly." Again, not enough to do anything with. Not enough to quote back to someone and say, "See." Just enough to keep the whole conversation hovering in that same grey zone everything else had lived in. I could feel myself getting more tense, mostly because I realized he was completely comfortable staying there. Inside the ambiguity, inside the pattern, he didn't need the interaction to become normal. He was fine with it staying strange, that made it worse. So I said very plainly, "You've been making me uncomfortable." That finally changed something, not a lot, but enough. His expression flattened slightly, not defensive, not apologetic, just less performative somehow. Then he said that wasn't the intention. And that line should have helped, it should have, but it didn't because it wasn't the same as denial. He didn't say you're imagining it. He didn't say that's not happening. He just said it wasn't the intention, which leaves a lot of room, too much room. I said, "Then what is the intention?" There was a pause, a real one this time, long enough that I thought maybe he'd finally say something concrete. Instead, he looked past me toward the garage exit and said, "You notice things." That sentence just sat there. I remember staring at him for a second because out of everything he could have said, that was somehow the one that bothered me most. Not because it explained anything. Because it made the whole thing feel mutual again. Like the pattern itself was the point. Not what he wanted from me, not what he was doing in the building, just the fact that I had noticed. I said, "That doesn't answer the question." He nodded slightly like he agreed with that. Then he said, "No, I guess it doesn't." And just like that, the conversation was over. Not because I decided it was, because he did. He stepped past me, calm as anything, and walked toward the stairwell instead of the elevator. Of course, I turned and watched him go. Same steady pace, same quiet physical presence as always. He pushed through the stairwell door and disappeared. And I stood there in the garage for a few seconds after, feeling not relieved, not frightened exactly, just deeply, deeply unsettled. Because I had wanted a direct interaction to simplify things. That's what people always imagine, right? Just talk to the person. Break the tension, humanize it. But humanizing him didn't help, it made it worse. Because now I knew for sure that the ambiguity wasn't accidental. He was choosing it. He was participating in it consciously. And once you know that, it's very hard to go back to pretending the whole thing is harmless. After that conversation in the garage, I stopped trying to understand him. That was the real change. Up until then, even with all the discomfort, part of me had still been treating the whole thing like a puzzle. if I could just line the details up the right way. If I could just get one clear answer, if I could just figure out the normal explanation hiding underneath it, then maybe the tension would go away. But after actually speaking to him, I realized something simple. Clarity was never going to come from him, because whatever was happening, he seemed perfectly comfortable leaving it unresolved. And if someone is okay with you feeling uncertain around them, that tells you enough. So I made a very practical decision. I stopped parking there. Not permanently at first, just for a while. I used street parking a few blocks away when I could, paid for a nearby overnight lot on weekends, took the inconvenience over the atmosphere. And honestly, the first few days felt ridiculous. Walking farther home, carrying groceries longer, paying extra to avoid a parking space in my own building. On paper, it sounded excessive, but the effect was immediate. The tension dropped, not all at once, but enough. Because once I removed myself from that repeated point of contact, the whole pattern lost structure. No more arriving and checking for the blue car, no more listening for engines, no more looking for reflections in tinted windows. That mattered more than I expected. A week later, I went down to the garage during the afternoon just to get something from storage. The blue car wasn't there, empty spot, no sign of it, and weirdly, instead of feeling relieved, I just felt tired. Because by that point, I no longer cared whether the pattern was still active when I wasn't participating in it. That was the thing I had finally learned. Not everything needs to be solved. Some things just need distance. A few days after that, I talked to the manager one more time. Not to escalate, just to ask whether the car had been seen again. He said yes, a couple of times, but less often. Then he added that someone on another floor had recently asked whether visitors were allowed to leave cars in the garage overnight without registration. That sentence stuck with me, because it meant the pattern was still brushing up against other people too. Not necessarily in the same way, but enough to be noticed. I asked whether they had figured out who he actually was. Resident, guest, anything official. The manager just said, not really. And somehow that was the most unsettling answer of all, because in the end that was the true shape of the whole story. Presence without identity, routine without explanation, tension without context. A couple of weeks later I saw the blue car one last time, not in the garage, on the street outside the building, parked across from the entrance, engine off, empty. I stood there for maybe 2 seconds looking at it, then kept walking. No adrenaline, no spike of fear, just that strange, familiar tension trying to rise again. And for the first time I didn't feed it. I didn't stop, didn't stare, didn't check for movement. I just kept going. Because by then I understood that whether there was a person in it, whether it had anything to do with me in that moment, whether the whole thing had some explanation, I'd never get. None of that changed what I needed to do. Keep moving, keep distance, stop participating in the pattern. About a month after that I moved, not because of him, not entirely. My lease was almost up anyway, and the whole thing had quietly changed how I felt in that building. That's something people underestimate. You don't need one huge event for a place to stop feeling neutral. Sometimes it's just repetition, a tension that settles into ordinary space. And once that happens, even if nothing escalates, the feeling stays. So I moved, different neighborhood, different building, no underground garage, and nothing like that ever happened again. No repeated overlap, no impossible timing, no strange notes, no half conversations in dim parking structures, just normal life, which after all of that felt almost weirdly generous. But the reason I still think about it sometimes isn't because I believe there was some grand explanation hiding underneath everything. Honestly, I don't know what the explanation was. Maybe he was just a very strange person who liked being noticed. Maybe the ambiguity itself was the point. Maybe I only saw half of a pattern and my brain did the rest. I can admit that possibility. What I can't deny is the effect it had. Because even if something remains technically explainable, there comes a point where your discomfort is real enough on its own. And that was the lesson I took from it. Not always trust your instincts in some dramatic, mystical way. Just this: if a pattern keeps making your environment feel wrong, you do not owe that pattern infinite patience just because you can't fully prove what it means. That's where this one ends. No big reveal, no final confession, no perfect answer. Just a car, a garage, a pattern that got too personal, and the very quiet relief of eventually stepping out of it. That's it. All right that one sits in a very specific place. Not loud, not obvious. Just that slow, uncomfortable realization that something can stay technically explainable and still feel deeply wrong. For the next story, we're shifting again. This one starts with a friendship. A normal one, the kind where you don't question much at first. But over time, little details start piling up, and eventually you realize the other person has been paying attention to you in a way that doesn't feel casual at all. Let's get into it. So this one is different again. No shared spaces. No random strangers. No unclear identity. This one is about someone I actually knew, and that's what made it worse. Because when something feels off around a stranger, you can step away. You can create distance. You can leave the situation. But when it's someone you already trust, you don't notice the shift until it's already happened. I met her through mutual friends. Nothing special at first. Just one of those people who shows up in the same group a few times until eventually you start talking more directly. Her name was Lena. Easy to talk to, good listener. The kind of person who remembers small things about you without making it feel like a big deal. At least that's how it felt in the beginning. We didn't become close immediately, it was gradual. Messages here and there, occasional coffee, shared conversations in group settings. Normal, completely normal. And honestly, that's what makes this kind of situation hard to identify early, because nothing stands out, everything builds quietly. One of the first things I noticed about her, and I remember this clearly now, was how quickly she picked up on details. Not just surface things, specifics. I'd mention something once, casually, and she'd bring it up days later. Not in a weird way, just enough to show she remembered. Which again is usually a good thing. It feels like attention, interest, connection. How I interpreted it at the time, and for a while it stayed like that, easy, comfortable. Then small things started to shift, not in what she said, in how often she seemed to already know something. For example, I'd bring up a place I had just been to, and she'd say something like, "Oh yeah, that place gets really busy around 7. Which is fine, except I hadn't told her when I went, or I'd mention I was tired and she'd say, "You've been staying up late again." Not as a question. As a statement, and again, that could be nothing. People make assumptions, people guess, sometimes they're right, but it kept happening, in ways that felt slightly ahead of what I had actually shared. At first I brushed it off, didn't even question it properly, because when someone is generally pleasant and easy to be around, your brain fills in the gaps in their favor. That's just how it works. The first time I really paused was over something small. I had taken a different route home from work one day, not something I told anyone about, just walked a different way. Later that evening we were texting, and at one point she said, "Did you go past the park today? It looked nice." That's it, one sentence, and it landed wrong immediately, not because it was impossible, but because it wasn't based on anything I had said. So I asked, "What do you mean?" And she replied, "Just felt like you would." That answer didn't explain anything, but it also didn't sound strange enough to push, so I let it go, again, and that's the pattern in this kind of situation. Something feels off, you notice it, you question it briefly, then you explain it away because there's no clear reason not to until it happens again. After that message about the park, I started noticing the timing of things a lot more, not just what Lena knew, but when she knew it, because that's what made it feel off. If someone knows a lot about you because you told them, that's one thing. If they keep landing just slightly ahead of what you've actually shared, that's different. A few days later, I was meeting a friend for coffee after work. Spur-of-the-moment plan, not posted anywhere, not mentioned in the group chat, just a quick text exchange between me and one other person. We met at this small place I don't usually go to, nothing special, just somewhere convenient. About 20 minutes in, my phone buzzed. Message from Lena. "Are you at that cafe on Mercer?" I just stared at the screen for a second, because again, on paper, there were explanations. Maybe she was nearby, maybe she saw me by chance, maybe it was a lucky guess, so I replied, "Yeah, why?" She sent back, "Walked past and thought I saw you." That should have settled it, and maybe part of me even wanted it to. But the thing is, the cafe is set back from the street a bit. You can see inside, sure, but not clearly unless you actually slow down and look. And what bothered me wasn't that she'd seen me. It was that the message arrived without any normal follow-up attached to it. Not "want me to stop in," not "small world," not even "funny coincidence," just confirmation, like she was noting where I was. That was new. And once I noticed that tone, I couldn't stop noticing it elsewhere too. A week later, I had a rough day at work, didn't tell anyone, didn't post about it, didn't complain in the group chat. I just got home, changed, and sat there for a while doing absolutely nothing. Maybe an hour later, she texted, "You get quiet in a very specific way when work is bad." That message bothered me more than it should have, not because it was impossible, but because it skipped right past normal conversation. No "how was your day?" No "you okay?" Just an observation, a conclusion. I replied, "What does that mean?" And she said, "Nothing bad, just noticeable." That word "noticeable" really stayed with me, because it matched the overall feeling of being around her at that point. Not watched exactly, not yet, just noticed in ways I hadn't invited. And the thing about that is, from the outside it can sound flattering. Someone pays attention, someone remembers details, someone sees patterns in you. That can feel intimate, until it starts happening too often. Until it feels less like connection and more like collection. That's where it was starting to drift for me. Then there was the bookstore thing, and that was the moment it became much harder to dismiss. I had gone into this little used bookstore on a Saturday afternoon, one I almost never went to, not because I disliked it, it just wasn't on my usual route. I was inside maybe 10 minutes, wondering when I heard my name. I turned around, Lena, standing 2 aisles over. Smiling like this was the most natural thing in the world, and for a second I genuinely didn't know how to react, because chance meetings happen. Of course they do, cities overlap, people go places, that's normal. So I smiled back and said, "Oh hey." She walked over and said, "I had a feeling you'd be here today." That line landed immediately, not loudly, just wrong. I laughed a little and said, "Why would you think that?" And she shrugged like it was obvious. "You seemed like you were in that kind of mood." Again, not impossible, not even clearly inappropriate. But the cumulative effect of all these little moments was getting hard to ignore, because each one by itself had enough plausible deniability to survive. But stacked together, they built a very different feeling. We talked for maybe 5 minutes in the bookstore, normal enough conversation. Books, weekend plans, random stuff. Then I left. And on the walk home, I kept replaying that sentence. I had a feeling you'd be here today. Maybe it was just a weird way of speaking. Maybe she liked sounding intuitive. Maybe she didn't realize how strange that sounded in context. All possible, but it was starting to become a pattern with her too. She kept framing knowledge as instinct, a feeling, a guess, a vibe, never anything concrete enough to challenge, always just enough to unsettle. That evening, I brought it up to a mutual friend. Not seriously, just kind of joking. I said, "Does Lena ever weirdly know things about where you've been?" My friend laughed and said, "She notices everything." That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made me more curious. So I asked, "Yeah, but like everything?" And my friend paused for half a second, then said, "Sometimes a little too much." That was the first outside confirmation that the feeling wasn't entirely in my head. Not a big warning, not some dramatic reveal. Just enough to tell me I wasn't the only person who had ever brushed up against that edge with her. And once I had that, I started paying a lot closer attention. Once I started paying close attention, I realized something simple. If all of this was just coincidence, then changing my routine should break the pattern. That was the easiest way to think about it, not in some dramatic investigative sense, just basic variation. So that's what I did. Nothing huge, just small changes. Different cafe, different route home, different timing on errands, little things that nobody would reasonably predict unless they were either very lucky or paying much more attention than I'd understood. The first test happened a few days later. I usually stop at the same small grocery store on my way home from work maybe twice a week. That evening, instead of going there, I went to a place across town. Not because I needed anything specific. Just because it was far enough outside my normal pattern that it felt useful. I was inside maybe 15 minutes, grabbed a few things, headed to the checkout, and while I was waiting in line, I saw her, not next to me, not suddenly at my shoulder, just in the reflection of the freezer doors across the aisle. Lena, walking into the store, basket in hand, looking completely normal. That moment did something unpleasant to my stomach, because one coincidence is one thing. Even 2 or 3 can still be coincidence, but once you start intentionally varying your movement and the same person keeps appearing inside the variation, it gets much harder to settle around. She saw me maybe 10 seconds later and smiled immediately. No visible surprise. No, "Oh wow, what are the odds?" Just a smooth little smile, like the overlap itself wasn't remarkable. She walked over and said, "You switched stores." Not, "I didn't expect to see you here." Not funny timing. Just an observation. I said, "Yeah, felt like a change." And she nodded once like that confirmed something. Then she said, "I figured." That was it, 3 words, and somehow that felt worse than if she had said something openly strange. Because again, it kept everything in that same maddening middle space. Not enough to accuse, not enough to prove, just enough to feel watched. I left quickly after that, not dramatically, just didn't linger. And the whole drive home, I kept doing the same thing I always did, trying to force it back into normality. Maybe she shops there too, maybe it's random. Maybe she only said you switched stores because I'd mentioned the other one before. All true, all possible, but none of them addressed the cumulative effect anymore. A few days after that, I changed something else. Instead of going straight home after work, I took the train 2 stops further and walked through a part of the city I never really spent time in. No reason, just movement, just unpredictability. I stopped at a bookstore for maybe 10 minutes, then a coffee place I'd never been to before, then wandered for another half hour before heading back. And for most of that evening, nothing happened. No Lena, no messages, no weird overlap, which honestly made me feel almost embarrassed again. Like maybe I had crossed into pattern hunting hard enough that normal absence felt like evidence too. Then at 9:14 p.m. while I was on the train home, my phone buzzed. Message from Lena. "You take longer routes when you're trying to think." I stared at that text for a long time, because this time there wasn't even a visible coincidence to attach it to. She wasn't there, at least not that I had seen. There was no bookstore hello, no cafe overlap, no moment I could point to and say, okay, she must have just happened to notice me. Just a sentence, timed too precisely to the evening I had just spent deliberately moving in a way that didn't belong to my normal routine. I replied, "What makes you say that?" And she answered almost immediately, "You disappear differently when it's on purpose." That sentence sat with me in a way I still don't really like. Because it didn't sound like guessing anymore. It sounded like tracking variation. Not just noticing who I was in general, but noticing how I moved when I was trying not to be noticed. That's a very different feeling. And that was the point where I stopped experiencing her attention as flattering in any form. It just felt invasive, quietly invasive. The next day, I didn't answer any of her messages for a while. Not as a strategy, I just genuinely didn't know what to say. How do you even respond to someone who keeps presenting oddly specific knowledge as intuition? If you confront it directly, you risk sounding dramatic. If you ignore it, the pattern keeps going. If you joke about it, you normalize it. That's the trap. Later that evening, she sent another message. Short, simple. "Did I make you uncomfortable?" And the thing is, that should have been the easiest possible opening. A clear chance to say yes. A clear chance to name it, but I still hesitated. Because even then, I didn't have a clean shape for what was wrong. Just accumulation, timing, overlap, precision. That sense that she kept arriving slightly ahead of what I had actually shared. So I wrote back, "Sometimes you seem to know things before I tell you them." She didn't respond for a minute, then she sent, "I pay attention." That was her explanation, not apology, not denial, not clarification, just "I pay attention." And that, more than anything else so far, made me realize we were probably not talking about the same boundary. For her, attention itself seemed neutral. Possibly even caring. For me, attention without context had started to feel like pressure. Like there was less and less room to simply exist without being observed into meaning. And once that feeling settles in, normal interaction gets very difficult. After that message, "I pay attention," I knew I couldn't keep pretending this would settle itself. Because up until then, everything had still been happening in that weird half space. Hints, patterns. Coincidences that didn't feel like coincidences. Comments that landed a little too precisely. But now we had actually touched the edge of the thing. I had said it felt strange. And instead of stepping back, she had basically confirmed that the attention was deliberate. Not malicious, maybe, but deliberate. So the next day I asked if she wanted to grab coffee. Not because I wanted to hang out, just because I didn't want this to keep living in text messages. She said yes immediately. Of course she did. We met at a cafe near the center of town. Neutral place. Busy enough that it wouldn't feel intense. And for the first few minutes, everything felt completely normal. That was the weirdest part. She looked normal, sounded normal, smiled normally. If someone had watched us from across the room, they would have thought it was just two friends catching up. Then I said, "I wanted to ask you about something." She nodded once and said, "Okay." And I remember noticing how calm she looked. Not cautious, not worried, just ready. So I said, "Sometimes it feels like you know where I've been or what I'm doing before I've told you." There was no visible surprise. No "what do you mean?" No defensive laugh, no confusion. She just looked at me for a second and said, "Because I usually do." That answer landed harder than I expected. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so flat, so matter of fact. I asked, "How?" And she took a sip of her coffee before answering, like the question wasn't strange at all. Then she said, "You're actually very predictable." That line stayed with me immediately, not because it was impossible. People are predictable. We all are to some degree. But the way she said it made it sound less like normal familiarity and more like a conclusion she had been quietly refining for a while. I said, "That doesn't really explain some of the timing." She tilted her head slightly and said, "What timing?" So I gave her examples. The cafe, the bookstore, the park comment, the longer route message, the grocery store, not accusing, just laying them out. She listened the whole time without interrupting. Then when I was done, she said something that made the entire conversation feel even stranger. She said, "You think I'm following you." Not as a question, as a statement, and the truth is. Until she said it like that, I hadn't actually used that word in my own head. Not cleanly, because following sounds active, deliberate, clear. What I had been feeling was murkier than that, so I said, "I don't know what to think, I just know it feels like you keep arriving slightly before I understand how you'd know where I am." She was quiet for a second, then she said, "I'm not following you." That should have helped. Really, it should have, but the problem was it didn't answer the deeper thing. Because whatever she was doing still felt too precise to be casual. So I asked again, "Then how do you know?" And that's when she said the thing that really changed how I saw her. She said, "Because once you understand someone's rhythms, they stop being random." I just looked at her because that sentence didn't sound like friendship. It sounded like observation, like study. And again, maybe that's dramatic wording, but that's honestly how it felt in the moment. Not warm, not relational. Just analytical. I said, "You understand my rhythms." And she nodded like that was obvious. Then she said, "You go to certain kinds of places depending on your mood. You move differently when you want to be left alone. You pick quieter routes when you're thinking. You repeat things more than you realize." Everything in that sentence was technically possible. A very perceptive person could notice those patterns, that's true. But hearing someone say them out loud about you, with that level of confidence, is a very different experience from simply being known. I felt this very specific internal shift, like I was suddenly sitting across from someone who had spent much more time constructing a version of me than I had ever agreed to. So I said, "Do you not hear how strange that sounds?" That was the first time her expression changed. Not much, just slightly. She looked genuinely puzzled. Then she said, "I hear that it makes you uncomfortable." That distinction mattered, because she didn't say, "I understand why it's strange." She said she understood that it made me uncomfortable. As in, the discomfort existed in me, not necessarily in the behavior itself. That was revealing. I said, "It's not just discomfort, it feels invasive." She was quiet for a second after that. Then she asked, "Because I noticed too much." And that question was so close to the actual issue while still somehow missing it, because it wasn't just too much. It was attention without context, closeness without permission, familiarity arriving faster than trust should have allowed it to. So I said, "Because you don't just notice things, you seem to build expectations around them, and then you act like those expectations are normal." That landed a little more clearly. I could see it in the way she stopped moving for a second. Then she said carefully, "I didn't realize it felt like that from your side." And for the first time in the whole conversation, I actually believed she might be telling the truth, not because it fixed anything, but because there are people who genuinely don't understand that intense observation can feel like pressure instead of care. To them, attention is attention. Full stop. They don't always understand that attention has volume, shape, context, and past a certain point it stops feeling good. I said I need it to be less. Simple, clear, not a debate, not a long explanation, just less. She nodded slowly. And said, okay, that should have been the end of it. Maybe it should have resolved things, but honestly, I didn't leave that conversation feeling better. I left feeling like I finally understood the shape of the problem, and sometimes that's worse, because once something has a shape, you can't keep pretending it's just a vibe. For the first few days after that conversation, things actually did get quieter. No oddly timed messages, no comments that felt one step ahead of what I'd said. No unexpected overlap in places I hadn't mentioned, and for a moment I thought maybe that was enough. Maybe namming it had done what silent discomfort never could. Maybe she genuinely hadn't realized how it felt, and now that she did, she would step back. That seemed possible, reasonable even, so I tried to let the whole thing settle. I answered her messages normally. Not constantly, not warmly in some overly reassuring way, just normally. Basic conversation, surface-level things. A meme here, a short reply there, nothing personal enough to create that same sense of being read too closely. And that worked, at least on the surface. But then I started noticing a different kind of shift. Not in what she knew, in how carefully she didn't show that she knew it. That's what made it worse. Because before the strange part had been visible, she'd say something too precise, she'd appear somewhere too neatly. She'd make one of those comments that landed just slightly ahead of what felt normal. Now it was subtler, contained, more disciplined, and because of that it became harder to point to anything specific while somehow feeling more deliberate than before. The first time I noticed it clearly was on a Tuesday evening. I had gone quiet for most of the day, not on purpose, just busy, a little tired, not in the mood to talk much. Around 8 p.m. she sent one message, hope today got less heavy. That was it, short, gentle, perfectly reasonable, and if you saw that message by itself it would look caring. It was caring in a way, but the problem was I hadn't told her the day was heavy, hadn't complained, hadn't hinted, hadn't posted anything, hadn't even been particularly expressive in the one or two replies I'd sent earlier, so there it was again, knowledge arriving without context. Just presented more softly now, less visibly. I stared at the message for a while before replying with something simple like, thanks, just a long day. And almost immediately I felt annoyed with myself, not because I'd replied, because I was already editing my reaction around her again, already choosing the version of reality that was easiest to live beside. That was what I hated most, not even the behavior itself sometimes, the way it made me start adjusting. A few days later it happened again in a slightly different form. A mutual friend had invited a few of us out for drinks, very casual, nothing unusual. I almost didn't go, then changed my mind at the last minute. Didn't tell anyone in advance, just showed up. When I got there, Lena was already there, leaning against the bar talking to someone. She saw me, smiled and said, I thought you might still come. That sentence was harmless, almost. If you took it at face value, it was normal. People say things like that all the time. But in the context of everything else, it landed with that same familiar tightness. Not because it proved anything, because it carried that same energy of her already having made a model of my movement and then quietly checking it against reality. And the thing is, she said it in a way that made any reaction from me feel unreasonable. What am I supposed to say to that? Why did you think that? Why are you mapping my behavior like that? Can you stop anticipating me out loud? None of those fit the moment, so I just smiled and moved past it. Again, and that's the trap with subtler versions of the same pattern. Once someone gets more careful, the discomfort becomes harder to articulate without sounding like the difficult one. Then there was the message that really made it click for me. It was late, maybe 11 p.m. I was at home, sitting on the floor in my living room because I hadn't bothered to put something away and just ended up there, half scrolling, half thinking. My phone buzzed. Message from Lena. You do that when you don't want to be inside your own head too much. No context, no lead-in, no question. I actually felt my chest go cold reading that, because now we were somewhere else entirely. This wasn't about where I had been, not about what route I took. Not about whether I'd gone quiet for the day. This was interior, interpretive, and again, maybe she was guessing. Maybe she was right by accident. Maybe I'd said something similar weeks earlier and she was drawing from that. All possible, but it didn't matter anymore. Because even if she was right, I didn't want to be held that way in her mind. Not with that kind of confidence. Not without being invited into the process. I replied, what are you talking about? And she sent back, you go still, in a very specific way. That sentence stayed with me much longer than it should have, because it told me exactly what had changed after our conversation. She hadn't stopped observing, she had just become more selective about when she showed the observation, which meant the talk we had at the cafe hadn't changed the underlying thing, it had only changed the presentation. And once I realized that, something in me really started pulling away, not dramatically. Just steadily, I stopped answering as quickly, stopped telling her small things, stopped mentioning where I was going, who I was with, what kind of day I was having, not as punishment, just because I no longer wanted to give more material to whatever internal framework she was quietly building. That's when I understood something I hadn't had words for before. The problem wasn't just that she noticed patterns. It was that her noticing had begun to feel like ownership. not literal ownership. It's that strange relational version of it, where someone starts treating their interpretation of you as a kind of access. And access, once it feels unchosen, becomes very hard to live with. Once I started pulling back, the difference showed up almost immediately. Not in anything dramatic, no confrontation, no why are you acting different, no direct questions, just subtle pressure. The first thing I noticed was the timing of her messages. Before they had felt predictive, now they felt testing. Short messages spaced out, not random but placed, like she was checking whether I would respond the same way I used to. Busy today? Did you get some rest? You've been quieter. All completely normal sentences, individually harmless, but in the context of everything else they didn't feel like conversation. They felt like probes. And the thing about pulling back is that it breaks the rhythm the other person is used to, which means they either adapt or they try to restore the rhythm. She was trying to restore it, not aggressively, not obviously, just consistently enough that I could feel it. So I stayed consistent too. Short replies, neutral tone, no extra detail. If she asked how my day was, I said fine. If she asked what I was doing, I said nothing much. No elaboration, no hooks, and for a few days that just sat there, uneven, like a conversation that had lost its shape but hadn't officially ended. Then something shifted. Instead of asking questions, she started making statements again. Carefully, less direct than before, but still there. You seem more closed off this week. You're not sharing as much. You're harder to read right now. That last one stayed with me. Harder to read, not harder to talk to. Not I miss how we used to talk. Just harder to read. That wording mattered, because it showed exactly what she felt she had lost. Not closeness, access. And hearing that out loud made it very clear that we were still not aligned on what the relationship actually was. So I replied, I think I just want a bit more space. Simple, no explanation, no debate, just a boundary. There was a longer pause than usual before she answered. Then she said, space from me or from everything? That question wasn't unfair, but it also wasn't neutral, because it tried to position the situation as something broader, something less specific. And I didn't want to blur it, so I said, from you mostly. That was the most direct I'd been, and for a moment I expected that to create friction, or at least a visible reaction, but it didn't. Her response came back calm. Okay, just that, and again that should have been reassuring. But by that point I had learned that her calm didn't necessarily mean the same thing as resolution. It often meant she was processing, reorganizing, adjusting the pat. The next few days were quiet, very quiet. No messages, no overlapping group chats, no subtle comments, nothing, and for the first time in a while I felt clear, not relieved exactly, just not being actively interpreted, which is a strange thing to notice when it disappears, because you don't realize how present that feeling is until it's gone. About a week later I saw her again in person, at a small gathering with mutual friends, completely normal setting. People talking, music low, nothing intense. She was there already when I arrived, and when she saw me she smiled. Same as always, no tension, no visible awkwardness. We said hi, brief conversation, surface level, and for a few minutes it almost felt like everything had settled into something manageable. Then halfway through the night, she said something quietly while we were standing off to the side. You've changed how you move around me. That sentence was so specific that it almost didn't register at first. I said, what do you mean? And she said, you're more careful now. Again, not accusatory, not emotional, just observational. And the problem with that is she was right. I was more careful. Careful about what I said, careful about what I shared, careful about how much space I gave her to interpret. But hearing it reflected back like that made the whole thing feel circular again. Like even the boundary itself had become something she was mapping. I said, yeah, I think I am. She nodded slightly, like that confirmed something she had already concluded. Then she said, I don't think you realize how consistent you used to be. And that was the moment I understood something very clearly. For her, the change in me wasn't just emotional, it was structural. Like a system she had learned had stopped behaving the same way, and she was noticing the difference, tracking it, trying to understand it, which meant that even now, even after I had asked for space, I was still being observed in that same framework, just at a distance. That's when I realized the situation wasn't going to resolve through conversation alone, because the issue wasn't misunderstanding, it was perspective. We were relating to each other in fundamentally different ways, and once that's the case, there isn't really a clean middle ground. After that night, I knew the situation wasn't going to settle into something neutral, not naturally, not over time. Because even when things were quieter, the underlying dynamic hadn't actually changed. She was still observing, still interpreting, still framing my behavior as something consistent enough to map, just doing it more carefully now, and I didn't want to keep existing inside that. So a few days later, I decided to make it explicit, not aggressive, not emotional, just clear. I asked if we could talk again. She agreed immediately, same as before. We met during the afternoon this time. Different place, quieter, less background noise, and this time I didn't ease into it. I didn't try to soften the edges of what I was saying. I just said, I don't think this is working the way it should. She didn't react right away, just watched me for a second, then said, what do you mean by that? So I said, I think the way you relate to me feels more like observation than connection, and I don't feel comfortable inside that. That was the clearest way I could put it. No examples. No long explanations, just the core of it. She was quiet for a few seconds after that. Then she asked, because I noticed patterns. And again, that was close, but not quite it. So I said, because it feels like you build a version of me based on those patterns and then interact with that version instead of just being with me. That landed. I could see it in the way she shifted slightly. Not defensive, not dismissive, just thinking. Then she said something that I still think about sometimes. I thought that was being with you. That sentence explained everything. Not in a way that fixed it, but in a way that made it make sense. For her, attention was connection. The more she noticed, the more she understood, the closer she felt. But for me, that same process had crossed into something else, something that felt like being studied instead of known. I said, I get that, I just don't experience it that way. She nodded slowly. And there was no tension in that moment, no argument, just two different ways of seeing the same thing that didn't overlap. Then she asked, so what do you want to do? And I remember feeling a kind of clarity I hadn't had before, because at that point the answer wasn't complicated anymore. I think we should take a step back, like actually step back. She didn't ask what that meant, didn't push for details, just said, okay. And again, that calmness, that lack of resistance. It didn't feel like agreement. It felt like acceptance of data, like she had reached a conclusion. We sat there for a few more minutes, small talk, nothing meaningful, and then we left, no dramatic ending. No let's stay in touch, no emotional closure, just a quiet stop, and that was it. After that conversation, everything stopped. Not slowly, not in phases, just stopped. No more messages, no more check-ins, no more observations wrapped as casual comments. It was clean. And for the first few days, it felt almost strange. Because when something has been present in your space consistently, even if it's uncomfortable, its absence has a kind of weight to it, like a sound that's suddenly gone. You don't notice the silence at first, then you realize how much it was there before. I went back to my normal routine pretty quickly. Work, friends, weekends, all the usual things. And nothing else like that happened again. No one anticipating where I'd be. No one commenting on my internal state without context. No one framing my behavior as something already mapped out. Just normal interaction, which after everything felt very simple. In a good way. A few weeks later I heard from one of our mutual friends that Lena had been around less, not gone, just less present in the same spaces. No explanation attached to it, no story, just a quiet shift, and I didn't follow up, didn't ask, didn't feel the need to. Because whatever that situation had been, it had reached its natural end point. Not through conflict, not through anything bad happening, just through incompatibility becoming clear enough that continuing didn't make sense anymore. And that's what makes this one feel strange even now, because there's no villain in it. No obvious harm, no single moment you can point to and say that's where it went wrong. It was all subtle, gradual, built out of small things that on their own could all be explained. And if you told the story in pieces, most of it would sound harmless. Someone who pays attention, someone who remembers details, someone who notices patterns. None of that is inherently bad. In fact, in most contexts, it's the opposite. But the part that stayed with me wasn't what she did. It was how it felt to be on the receiving end of that level of attention without having chosen it. Because attention, past a certain point, stops feeling like connection. It starts feeling like pressure. Like there's less room to just exist without being interpreted. Less space to be inconsistent, to change your mind, to move without it being noticed and folded into some larger pattern. And I think that's the part that's hard to explain unless you've felt it. Because from the outside, nothing wrong is happening. But from the inside, something is slightly off in a way that doesn't go away. And over time, that's enough. That's enough to step back. Enough to say this doesn't feel right, even if I can't fully prove why. If there's anything I took from it, it's this. Not every uncomfortable situation needs a clear negative label to be valid. You don't have to wait for something to become obviously bad to trust the feeling that it's not right for you. Sometimes something is just too much in a way that doesn't match how you want to be seen. And that's reason enough. That's where this one ends. All right, that's all for this set of stories. Nothing loud, nothing over the top. Just those slow, uncomfortable situations that build quietly and stay with you longer than you expect. If you're listening to this while relaxing, gaming, or trying to fall asleep, I appreciate you being here. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.